Hey there and welcome back. Settle yourself in wherever you happen to be, and let the day you have had begin to loosen its grip and slip away. This is a quiet hour, set aside for one of those unhurried stories that ask nothing of you at all but your company while sleep makes its slow way toward you. It is meant for anyone who likes to drift off inside the life of someone long gone, to let an old century close over them and carry them softly down. If it suits you, I will take you back more than 100 winters into the corridors of palaces and the modest rooms tucked in behind them, into the story of a woman whom the wider memory has mostly let slip. You need not hold on to every name, nor keep track of every date. You can let the words wash past you the way rain runs down a darkened window pane, and should sleep find you long before the end, that is just as it ought to be. So lean back into the warmth around you, and let the present evening thin and grow faint. For tonight we are going to sit a while with a girl who was born inside a royal palace, and judged, all the same, not quite royal enough to matter, a girl whose family slipped abroad to dodge the people they owed money to, and who would one day stand crowned beside a king and watch 3 of her own sons take the throne after him in their turn. Her name was Mary of Teck. There is a moment, far along in her story, when she stands in a doorway and is told that the young man she is promised to marry will not live out the week. We will reach that doorway together, but not yet. Before we begin in earnest, let me say one small thing, and then I will not break the quiet again. If hours like this one suit you, these patient wanders through the lives of people gone 100 winters or more, then you are very welcome to subscribe, so that the next of them can find its way to you when it is ready. I put these histories together slowly, turning over old letters and old household ledgers, and the small surviving particulars that make a person who is long dead feel near to us once more, and it means a great deal to know the result keeps somebody gentle company in the dark. Nothing here is in any rush. Should you prefer simply to fall asleep tonight and let all the rest of it go, that is more than enough, and it pleases me to picture it. But if you would care to return to evenings shaped like this one, the door here stays open, and your coming back would be a quiet happiness to me. Picture this: a long, low frontage of weathered red brick on the western edge of London, set among damp green gardens where the elms drip and tick after rain. It is not a palace of marble and gilt and great staircases. It is a worn and comfortable old place, carved up within into many separate apartments, where the lesser figures of a great royal house are lent rooms to live in when no grander residence can be spared for them. Kensington Palace, they call it, and it has the air less of a throne room than of a genteel and slightly faded boarding house for the well-born. On a late spring day in 1867, in a set of those borrowed rooms, a child is born to a princess, who is herself the granddaughter of a king, and the child is a girl. Outside those walls, the country is at the very height of its confidence. The old queen on her throne, the empire spreading its red across the map of the world, the railways and the factories roaring, the certainties of the age, standing as firm as they would ever stand. Inside the quiet apartment, none of that grandeur quite reaches. There is a new baby, and there is already the faint and familiar worry about how everything is to be paid for. To picture her infancy rightly, you must hold 2 things in the mind at once: the grandeur and the shortage, for they sat side by side in every room she knew. The family had their apartments here, lent by the old queen, and they had besides a pretty retreat in the country at Richmond, a graceful lodge set within a royal park, granted to them by the crown, for the Tecks owned almost nothing outright, and lived, in the main, upon the kindness of richer relations. The rooms the infant May opened her eyes upon were handsome and well placed, not, in any true sense, her family's own. There were servants in livery, and there were unpaid bills in the drawers behind them. There were lovely objects set out upon the tables, and a quiet desperation in her father's study. An infant, of course, knows none of this. She feels only the warmth of arms and the settled rhythm of a household at peace. But the contradiction was the very water she was raised in, and by the time she was old enough to take in anything at all, she had grasped that her family's comfort was a borrowed comfort, held on sufferance, and that the smiling surface of their days rested upon ground that could give way. It is the kind of knowledge that marks a child to the bone, and it marked her. They will christen her with a long ribbon of names laid across one very small infant: Victoria, Mary Augusta, Louise Olga, Pauline Claudine Agnes. The first of them, a careful compliment to the godmother and queen who looms over the whole family. But no one will ever call her any of those grand things in the ordinary run of life. To her mother and her father and the brothers who will come after her, she will simply be May, after the soft green month that brought her into the world, and May she will remain to those who love her best for the whole of her long life, even when the rest of the world has learned to call her something far more stately. There is something fitting in that homely little name attached to so much inherited grandeur, for it catches exactly the doubleness of her position. She is, on the one hand, a great-granddaughter of a King of England, with some of the highest blood in the land running in her veins. She is, on the other, a poor relation in a lent apartment, a child of a branch of the family that the proudest courts of Europe regard with a faint and unmistakable condescension. To feel why, you have to understand that in the world she was born into, blood was not a simple thing, but a matter of fine and pitiless degree. It's not enough to be royal. You had to be royal in the right way, through the right marriages, on both sides, without a single flaw in the long descent. And there was a flaw in May's. It came down to her through her father, and it would shadow her for the whole first half of her life, this quiet, persistent question of whether she was, when it came to the one thing that mattered most, the making of a great marriage, entirely of the first rank. She could feel that question in the air of the grand drawing rooms long before she was old enough to put it into words. She could feel it in the careful way certain relations spoke to her mother, in the doors that opened readily and the doors that stayed, ever so politely, shut. A child notices these things, a watchful child, and May was nothing if not watchful, notices them and files them away and learns from them. And what May learned very early was that she would have to be better than her position, more correct, more dutiful, more flawlessly composed than the children who had nothing to prove. The famous stillness that the world would one day mistake for coldness, the granite self-command that would carry her through more sorrow than most lives ever hold, was being quarried here in these first years, out of a small girl's slow understanding that she could not afford to put a foot wrong. She was the eldest, and the only girl, and 3 brothers would follow her into the nursery in the years to come, so that she grew up a careful, tidy island in a rising sea of boys. And from the very start there was a quality in her that set her apart from her noisy, careless brothers. Where they spilled and shouted and forgot, she gathered and ordered and remembered. Even as a small girl, she liked her things kept in their right places, liked to know how a thing was made, and where it had come from, and whose hands had held it before her own. It was, you might think, an odd trait in so young a child, this hunger for order and for the settled history of objects, but it makes a kind of sense when you set it against the household she was growing up inside, a household that was warm and loving and almost entirely without discipline, where the money ran out faster than it ever came in, and nobody but her anxious father seemed troubled by it. In the middle of all that pleasant disorder, May made of her own neatness a private fortress. She would be the one fixed and reliable point in a world that never quite added up. It was a child's solution to a child's helplessness, and it would harden over the years into the very center of who she was. But to understand the disorder she was bracing herself against, we have to look closely at the two people who made it, the mother she adored and could not respect, and the father whose wounded pride sat at the heart of everything. That is the part of her story we turn to now. Her mother was a princess of the old blood, Mary Adelaide, a granddaughter of King George III and a first cousin to the Queen who then sat upon the throne. By descent she stood as high as almost anyone alive in the country, and yet her own life had been in its way a long lesson in how little high descent was worth without money and good fortune to go with it. She was a large woman, growing larger with the years, warm-hearted to a fault, generous past all prudence, and adored by the ordinary people of London, who knew her stout figure by sight and waved at her carriage as it rolled by. She gave to every good cause that asked her, and to a great many that never thought to. She sat on committees and opened bazaars and pressed coins into the hands of the poor, and she kept a household and a table on a scale that her purse could not begin to support. She had reached well past the usual marrying age still single, partly because she was poor, partly because she had grown so very stout, and partly because the suitable princes had quietly looked elsewhere until she had become, in the gentle cruelty of her own relations, the family's standing problem, the warm and likeable aunt, whom nobody quite knew what to do with. It is worth dwelling on her for a moment, because May's whole character was shaped in answer to her. Mary Adelaide loved her daughter dearly, and did her real harm in only one respect, the example she set with money, an example May spent her life refusing. For the warmth was genuine, and the generosity was genuine, and the affection that filled those crowded rooms was the soil out of which May grew. But there was no order in any of it, no sense that tomorrow's bills were any concern of today's pleasures, and a clever, anxious child watching her beloved mother live so far beyond her means learned a dread that never left her. May would carry her mother's charity and her mother's sense of duty toward the poor for the whole of her life. She would never, not once, carry her mother's careless ease with a pound. Somewhere very young, she had drawn the line between them, and she would stand on her own side of it, without wavering, until she died. It would be wrong, all the same, to paint Mary Adelaide as merely a figure of fun or a cautionary tale, for she was loved, genuinely and widely, in a way that her careful daughter never quite would be. She had a gift the daughter lacked, an open, overflowing ease with people of every kind, a warmth that asked nothing and gave freely, so that the crowds who lined the streets to see her did so not out of duty, but out of real affection. She would lean from her carriage to speak to a working woman as readily as to a duchess. She remembered names, asked after sick children, laughed easily, and made others laugh. There was nothing grand or guarded about her, and the public adored her for it. And the daughter, watching, must have felt the pull of two truths that would never quite be reconciled in her, that her mother's warmth was a beautiful thing, and her mother's heedlessness a ruinous one, that to be loved as her mother was loved you had to let people in, and that to be safe, as her mother never was, you had to keep them out. She chose safety. It served her, and it cost her, and she could see, even as a girl, exactly what she was trading away. And then there was her father, and his trouble was of a different and sharper kind. His name was Francis, a prince of the small German duchy of Teck, a tall and handsome man with a soldier's straight back and a careful, smouldering pride. He had every outward mark of a great gentleman, and one inward wound that never healed, for the blood he had been born with did not, in the eyes of the strict, quite come up to the mark. His own father had made what was called a morganatic marriage, a match between a royal man and a woman of lower rank, and the rule governing such unions was as clear as it was merciless. The blood of the lesser parent dragged the whole line down with it. The children stood outside the true succession, barred from its highest titles and its inheritances, noble certainly, but set a rung below the purest royalty and kept there. So Francis had come into the world grand, but not grand enough, addressed as a serene highness, when every fibre of him longed for the royal highness that the great courts withheld, a prince who was not quite a prince in the only sense that the proudest of his relations cared about. It is worth understanding plainly what that meant, because it ran through everything. His people were the royal house of Württemberg, a respectable German kingdom, but his own father had married for love a beautiful Hungarian countess who simply was not royal, and the iron rule of dynastic marriage decreed that such a match, however happy, tainted the line that flowed from it. The children could take a title, but not the rank. They were styled highness of a lesser sort, set apart, reminded at every turn that they stood below the salt of true royalty. To a sensitive and ambitious man it was a lifelong sentence, served out in 100 small slights, and Francis served it badly, never able to rise above the grievance, or to stop measuring himself against what he had been denied. May absorbed the whole bitter logic of it without being told, understanding from her earliest years that blood was graded like coin, that some was current at full value and some was discounted, and that hers, through her father, would always be examined for the flaw before it was accepted for the worth. It was a hard thing to grow up knowing, and it made her, paradoxically, both proud and humble, certain of her own quality, and braced, always, for the cool appraising glance that might find her wanting. You can imagine what that did to a proud man, and it is no exaggeration to say it coloured everything. He was brave, he was conscientious, he had served as a soldier with credit, and none of it could buy back the half-step of rank he had been denied at birth. He felt the slight in every drawing-room, in each order of precedence that placed him below men. He considered no better than himself, in the very air of the courts, where his marriage to an English princess was regarded as a piece of charity to him rather than an honour to her. He had no fortune of his own to set against the disadvantage. He had married Mary Adelaide in part because she, too, was a difficult case the family wished to settle, the poor stout spinster and the proud penniless prince, making between them a match that suited everyone except perhaps the strict accountants of royal rank. And so the household into which May was born held, at its very centre, this double strain. A mother who could not manage money, and a father who could not manage his own wounded dignity, the one scattering warmth and debt in every direction, the other brooding over a lifelong grievance he was powerless to mend. There is a sadness in Francis that deepens as his story runs on, and it touched May more nearly than she ever said. For the wound of his birth never closed, and the years of debt and dependence rubbed at it without mercy, and in time the proud, anxious soldier began to give way under the strain of a life that had promised him so much and delivered so little. His temper frayed. His health in the end broke. He would suffer in his later years from the kind of slow decline that robs a proud man of his dignity by degrees, and his clever, watchful daughter would witness it, and learn from it the last and hardest of her early lessons, that grievance is a poison, that to brood upon a slight is to let it eat you from within. She loved her father, and she pitied him, and she resolved, with the quiet iron that was already her nature, never to follow him down that particular road. Whatever was withheld from her, whatever doors were shut, she would not let the shutting of them sour her. It is one of the most striking things about the woman she became that with every reason to be bitter, she was never, in any account that survives bitter at all. That refusal was forged here, at her father's side, in the long shadow of his unhappiness. Out of those two threads, the careless warmth and the wounded pride, the whole cloth of May's childhood was woven, and out of them, by a kind of stubborn reaction, she made herself. She would have her mother's heart but her father's seriousness, without his bitterness. She would care for rank and form and the proper order of things, as he did. But she would never let the caring curdle into the resentment that had soured him. And she understood, with a clarity that was remarkable in one so young, that the morganatic shadow over her father's name fell across her own future as well, that when the time came for her to be married, the strict accountants would open their books and look at her with exactly the cool, measuring eye that had so wounded him. She could do nothing about her blood, but she could be, in every other respect, so correct and so dignified and so plainly fine that the shadow might be overlooked. That was the long, patient project of her girlhood, though she could not yet have named it so, to make herself, by sheer force of character, worthy of a place that her birth alone could not quite secure. And the first great test of that project, the test of whether all her careful self-making would be enough, was still years away, waiting for her in the cold arithmetic of the royal marriage market. Before we reach it, though, we must follow the family through the disaster that very nearly swallowed them whole, and it is there that we go next. For a while, though, before the disaster came, there was an ordinary enough childhood to be had, and it is worth lingering in it, because these were the only untroubled years she would know for a long time. The nursery filled up with brothers. First came Adolphus, whom the family called Dolly, then a second boy named Francis after their father, and at last a third, Alexander, called Algy, so that May grew up the steady elder sister presiding over a tumble of younger boys. She mothered them and managed them and corrected them, and in doing so she rehearsed, without knowing it, the part she would play all her life, the calm one at the centre, the keeper of order, the person to whom others turned when things needed settling. Her brothers were fond of her, and a little in awe of her even then, for she had a seriousness that sat oddly on a girl so young, and a way of looking at a thing squarely and making up her mind about it, that older people found disconcerting. The brothers themselves would go their separate ways into lives of their own, soldiers and gentlemen of the kind that branch of the family produced, but in the schoolroom years they were simply her charges and her companions, and the bond among them was real. She was the one who knew where everything was, who could be relied upon to have the answer, who smoothed over the small disasters before they reached their parents' ears. A house run on too little money is a house of small daily crises, of things that cannot be bought, and treats that must be quietly gone without, and May became very early the child who managed those silences, who understood without being told when not to ask for something, who carried a portion of the household's worry that no child should have to carry. It made her old before her time, and it made her capable in a way that would astonish people for the rest of her life. But it took something too, some lightness that the other children kept, and she let go of without ever quite noticing it was gone. Her education was the patchy, old-fashioned sort that girls of her rank received in those days, a governess, lessons in the schoolroom, French and German, and a little history, drawing and needlework and the playing of the piano, the whole of it aimed less at filling her mind than at fitting her for the drawing-room and the marriage that was supposed to follow. But May took to learning with an appetite that went well beyond what was asked of her. She read more than she was set, and remembered what she read, and developed early a real and lasting hunger for history in particular, for the long unbroken story of families and thrones, and the slow descent of crowns from one head to the next. She liked facts, dates, lineages, the architecture of how the past fitted together. There was, perhaps, something steadying in it for her, this great orderly structure of history, standing so firm when her own small household stood on such shifting ground. She would grow into one of the best informed women of her time on exactly these matters, and the foundation was laid here in a girl who would rather read about the kings of England than do almost anything else. And all the while, under the pleasant surface, the ground was giving way. The trouble was the same trouble it had always been, only worse with every passing season, for debts left unpaid do not sit still, they grow. Her father drew up his careful columns of figures, and her mother cheerfully ignored them, and between the income that was modest and the spending that knew no limit, the gap widened year upon year into a chasm. There were the wages of servants who could not be let go without an unthinkable loss of face. There were the tradesmen's bills, mounting in their drawers. There were the dinners and the gowns and the carriages and the open-handed charity that Mary Adelaide could not bring herself to curb even now, when curbing it was the only thing that might have saved them. Letters went out to wealthier relations, pleading, explaining, promising. Money came in, was swallowed, and changed nothing. The whole elaborate life of the household was revealed, to anyone with eyes to see it, as a thing built on air. And the economies, when they came in the small, humiliating forms that a child notices most keenly. A treat quietly not provided. A dress made over rather than made new. The careful management of which tradesmen could still be asked for credit, and which had grown cold. The visitors who had to be entertained as though nothing were wrong, while behind the scenes the household stretched to cover the cost. For her mother, who lived in the moment and trusted to the future, none of this seemed to penetrate. She went on giving and spending and hoping as before. But for May, who saw and understood, every small economy was a small lesson in the precariousness of things, and every brave pretense at the front door was a quiet training in the art she would perfect above all others, the art of carrying on with perfect composure while the ground shifts underneath. She learned, in that house of cheerful insolvency, to keep two faces, the calm one the world saw, and the watchful one that counted the cost, and she would wear that doubleness for the rest of her days. May had eyes to see it. That is the heart of these years, and the making of so much that came after. She was old enough now to understand exactly what was happening, to feel the dread under the comfort, to watch the tradesmen grow cold, and the relations grow weary, and her father grow grey with worry, while her mother sailed serenely on. There is a particular loneliness in being the child who sees the truth that the grown-ups will not face, and May knew it. She could not fix the household's accounts. She could not make her mother prudent or her father solvent. What she could do, the only thing in her power, was to govern herself, and so she did, ever more strictly, making of her own conduct and her own small economies a quiet rebuke to the chaos around her, and a refuge from it. The discipline that the world would later find so formidable in the Queen was, in the girl, a kind of survival. It could not go on, and at last it did not. When May was about 16, the reckoning that her father had dreaded for so long arrived in full. The debts had grown beyond any patching, beyond any further loan or plea, to a sum the family simply could not meet, and there was, in the end, only one course left that a proud household could take without the final disgrace of open ruin. They would have to give up the life they could not pay for and go away, abroad, where everything cost less and the creditors could not so easily follow, and live quietly and cheaply until, somehow, their affairs were brought back into order. It was the well-worn road of the genteel and the broke, and the family took it now with all the shame that such a retreat carried. The doors of the house were closed, the servants were paid off and dismissed, the carriages were given up. and the whole proud, warm, hopeless household packed itself up and turned its face toward the continent and exile. For May it was the end of childhood, and the beginning of the strange, displaced years that would, against every expectation, make her. Let us follow her into it. They did not go straight to Florence. For a time they wandered, as families in their position often did, moving from one cheap and pleasant continental town to the next, lodging where the living was kind to a thin purse, drifting through Germany and along the lakes and down at last into Italy, a princess of England and her morganatic husband and their 4 children carrying the wreck of their old life from one set of rented rooms to another. It must have been a strange and unmooring time, especially for the parents, who felt the come down of it in their bones, the daily small humiliations of economy, the careful counting, the knowledge that everyone they met knew exactly why they were there. Mary Adelaide bore it with her usual large good humour, making friends wherever she went, charming the people of every town she passed through, quite unable to be cast down for long. Francis bore it less well, his pride chafing at the reduced circumstances, his temper, never easy, growing shorter as the years of exile stretched on. And May watched and learned and kept herself in hand, as she always did. In time they settled for a long and formative stretch in Florence, and of all the places her wandering girlhood took her, this was the one that left the deepest mark. Florence in those years was a magnet for exactly such people as the Tecks, the well-born and the underfunded of half of Europe, drawn by the gentle climate and the cheapness of life and the inexhaustible beauty of the place. For the city was, and is, one of the great treasure houses of the world, the very cradle of the Renaissance, its churches and palaces and galleries crowded with the finest work that human hands had ever made. And here was the thing that changed her. The family had little money for amusement, no grand society to move in, no round of balls and parties to fill the days. What they had, free for the looking, was art and history and beauty on every side, and May, alone among them, fell upon it with the whole hunger of her serious mind. She walked the city. She went into the churches and stood before the altar-pieces, the gold grounds and the grave Madonnas and the long lines of saints, until she began to understand not just what she was seeing, but how it had been made and why it was good. She went again and again into the galleries, those vast rooms hung with the work of masters, whose names she learned to know as friends, and she taught herself patiently, with no instructor but her own attention, to tell one hand from another, to read a painting, to see why this piece was fine and that one merely showy. She studied the furniture and the porcelain and the worked metal and the bindings of old books. She learned Italian well enough to read and to talk. She filled notebooks and filled her memory, and she found in the doing of it something she had been reaching for all her life without knowing its name. She found that beauty made by skilled hands endures, that a thing well made outlasts the hand that made it, and the owner who first prized it, and the century that produced it, passing on down the years as a kind of message from the dead to the living. That the past is not lost so long as its objects are kept and known and cared for. You can measure how deeply this took hold of her by the simple fact that it never left. Other girls in her position passed through Florence and saw only a pleasant exile, a place to wait out the family's troubles until they could go home. May saw a kind of education that the great houses of England, for all their wealth, could never have given her, and she took it with both hands. She learned to look, really to look, in a way that very few people ever trouble to. She would walk a gallery slowly, returning day after day to the same handful of pictures, until she understood not merely what they showed, but how they had been built, brushstroke upon brushstroke, the choices the maker had weighed, the centuries of skill standing behind a single panel. It was the opposite of her mother's way of moving through the world, which was all warmth and impulse and forgetting. It was patient and exact and possessive in the best sense, the instinct to hold a beautiful thing in the attention until it gave up its secrets. The grand collector and curator of her later years, the woman who could walk into a room and name the provenance of half the objects in it, was already fully present in the grave girl pacing those Italian galleries with her notebook. You have to see how much that meant to a girl like her and why it went so deep. She had grown up watching everything solid in her life turn out to be air, the comfortable house, the secure position, the very money under the table, all of it revealed as a thing that could vanish in a season and leave the family scrambling across the continent in disgrace. She had learned, before she was grown, that you cannot trust the apparent solidity of a life, that the ground gives way. And now, in the galleries of Florence, she found a kind of solidity she could trust at last, not in money, which fled, and not in rank, which the strict accountants could withhold, but in knowledge, and in workmanship, and in the long, faithful memory of beautiful things. Here was something that did not betray you. Here was a foundation that held. It was, though she could not have put it so at 16, a discovery that would organize the whole rest of her days, and it is impossible to understand the woman she became, the great collector and preserver of a later age, without understanding that it began here, in exile, in poverty, among the masterpieces of a foreign city, as the one rich thing in a poor and displaced girlhood. And she was all this while becoming the woman she would be in other ways too. She was growing tall and grave and beautifully composed, with a straight carriage and a still face and a manner that gave almost nothing away. People who met the young Princess May found her dignified, well-informed, a little reserved, and rather older than her years. She did not chatter or flirt or push herself forward. She had her mother's kindness, but none of her mother's expansiveness, her father's seriousness, but none of his bitterness, and over all of it a self-command learned in hard years that would have been remarkable in a woman twice her age. She had made herself, out of the materials of a difficult childhood, into something deliberate and finished and strong. When at last the family's debts had been brought within bounds and they could come home, they came back to England and to the graceful lodge in Richmond Park that the Queen had granted them, and there the grown Princess May took up the quiet, dutiful, slightly straightened life proper to a princess of her rank. She helped her mother with her endless charities. She kept house in the careful, economical way she had learned abroad. She moved through the round of the season, the dinners and the garden parties and the great occasions of the court, always correct, always composed, a little apart. To the people who met her, she was admirable and faintly unknowable, a serious young woman who plainly had more in her than she chose to show. And all the while the great question hung over her unanswered, the question of what was to become of her, whether the careful self she had built in exile would ever find the place it was made for, or whether it would go to waste in the long half-light of the unmarried and overlooked. She waited, and she did her duty, and she gave no sign of the hope or the fear that must have moved beneath the surface. That is where we go next. The question that waited for her was the question that waited for every well-born young woman of her day, and yet, in her case, it carried a particular weight and a particular dread. It was the question of marriage. We have to set aside for a moment everything our own age believes about how such things ought to work, because the world she came home to thought about them in a wholly different way. A marriage among the royalty of Europe was not, first and last, a meeting of two hearts. It was a matter of state, a transaction of blood and rank and alliance, negotiated between families and very often between nations, in which the wishes of the two young people concerned came a distant last. A princess was, in the coldest terms, an asset of her house, a card to be played to the family's best advantage, and the great courts kept the whole intricate web of who might suitably wed whom turning at the back of their minds the way a banker keeps his accounts. To be marriageable in that world was to be a good match on paper, and the paper recorded, above all, the purity of your descent. And there, of course, lay May's difficulty, the same shadow that had fallen across her father and now fell across her. On her mother's side, she was impeccable, a great-granddaughter of a king, with blood as good as any in England. On her father's side there was that morganatic flaw, that half-step down in rank, and the strictest of the royal houses, the very houses whose sons made the grandest matches, drew their line precisely there. To them she was not quite of the blood that a future king or a reigning prince ought to marry. She was charming, she was clever, she was beautifully brought up. Everyone agreed on her merits, and yet when the great families looked at her on paper, they saw the flaw before they saw the merits, and the most ambitious doors stayed very politely shut. She was royal enough to move in the highest circles, and not quite royal enough to be chosen from them, and that is a cruel place for a proud and capable young woman to stand. For a time it looked as though the shadow might simply win. The years began to pass as years do, and May moved from her early 20s toward the middle of them still unmarried, still waiting, while the whispers about her changed by slow degrees from speculation to something more like pity. She was poor, which counted against her. She carried the morganatic mark, which counted against her, and she was in herself grave and self-contained rather than dazzling, a young woman who did not sparkle in a ballroom or set out to charm, which in the shallow reckoning of the marriage market counted against her too. There was no shortage of respect for Princess Mary of Teck. There was simply a shortage of princes willing to overlook her birth, and a shortage of money to sweeten the overlooking. And so she might very easily have slipped, season by season, into the long half-life that her own mother had so narrowly escaped, the life of the unmarried royal poor relation, useful and dutiful and overlooked, always at the edge of the gathering and never at its centre, growing slowly older in other people's houses. It was real and a near thing, that fate, and she must have felt it closing around her. And there is a particular refinement of cruelty in that kind of waiting, which we should not pass over too quickly, because she lived inside it for years. To be the marriageable daughter who is not being chosen is to be on display and overlooked at the same time, to attend the weddings of others and smile, to be spoken of in the third person by people arranging matters over your head, to feel yourself quietly assessed and quietly set aside in drawing room after drawing room, season after season, while the polite pity gathers. She had no power in any of it. She could not propose, could not pursue, could not so much as let her own preference be known. She could only wait and be good and be worthy, and hope that somewhere in the great calculating machine of royal matchmaking her name would come up at the right moment beside the right one. For a proud and intelligent woman it must have been a slow torment, the more so because she bore it without a word of complaint, presenting to the world the same composed and dignified face whatever was happening behind it. That composure was not coldness, it was courage, the courage of a person enduring something humiliating with her head up. And it is worth remembering when the world later mistook her stillness for a want of feeling. What saved her from it was not her own doing, and it came from the 1/4 high enough to overrule the strict accountants of rank. For above the whole anxious calculation sat the old queen herself, and the old queen, as it happened, did not weigh the morganatic flaw nearly so heavily as the proud German courts did. Victoria had her own firm and rather unfashionable views, and chief among them was that character mattered more than the last fine degree of blood. She had watched the young Princess May over the years with a shrewd and approving eye, and she liked what she saw: a serious, sensible, dignified person, beautifully behaved, well-informed, plainly possessed of exactly the steadiness and good principle that the Queen prized above almost anything. The old Queen, for all her formidable manner, had a soft spot for May, and a kind of fellow feeling besides. Victoria too had known what it was to be a young woman shouldered with a weight beyond her years. Victoria too prized duty and seriousness above charm and show, and Victoria, who had buried the husband she adored and ruled on alone through decades of black-clad widowhood, recognized in the grave Teck girl a kindred capacity for endurance. She had little patience with the frivolous beauties her own son admired, and a great deal of regard for a young woman who read serious books and behaved impeccably and asked for nothing she had not earned. So when the Queen turned her mind to the problem of her wayward grandson, May was already, in her estimation, a known and valued quantity, a person she had taken the measure of and found sound. The favour of the most powerful sovereign in the world is a formidable thing to have on your side, and May, who had spent her life being quietly assessed and quietly passed over, found at last that the highest judge of all had assessed her and found her worthy. To Victoria, May was not a flawed match at all. She was a thoroughly suitable one, and more than that, she was the answer to a problem that had been gnawing at the old Queen for some time, a problem that sat at the very top of the family and threatened the future of the throne itself. For the Queen had a grandson, the young man who stood second in line to the throne after his father, and he was a source of deep and unspoken worry to everyone who loved the crown. To understand how May's fortunes turned, we have to turn to him, to the troubled prince, whose need for exactly such a wife as her would lift her in a single stroke from the edge of spinsterhood to the threshold of the throne. His name was Albert Victor, and the family called him Eddie, and his story, and the strange brief part May was meant to play in it, is where we go next. Eddie was the elder son of the Prince of Wales, the genial, pleasure-loving heir who would in time be Edward VII, and that made Eddie, after his father, the next in line but one, the grandson on whom, in the ordinary course of things, the throne would one day descend. He was a tall, slender, gentle young man, soft-eyed and soft-mannered, by all accounts amiable and good-natured, and entirely without cruelty. He was also, and the family knew it with a sinking heart, listless, dreamy, easily led, slow at his lessons to the point of real difficulty, vague in his ambitions, and worryingly prone to drift wherever the current of idle company and idle temptation happened to carry him. He had been tutored and travelled and sent into the army, and none of it had taken. He remained languid and unformed, a young man who seemed to float through his great destiny without ever quite waking up to it. To those who loved the crown and feared for it, he was a quiet catastrophe in the making, an heir who showed no sign of growing into the weight that would one day fall on him. There had already been trouble of the heart too, which only sharpened the family's anxiety to see him settled. He had fallen, sincerely and stubbornly, for a French princess, Helene of Orleans. But she was a Roman Catholic, and the law and the temper of the country made a Catholic bride for a future king simply impossible, and that hope had collapsed in tears and disappointment. The episode frightened the family. It showed how easily the soft, suggestible prince might attach himself to the wrong person, and how much harm such an attachment might do. What Eddie needed, they all agreed, and the old Queen most firmly of all, was a wife, and not merely a wife but the right wife, a young woman of sense and strength and unimpeachable character, who could give him the backbone he so plainly lacked, who could steady him and steer him and supply, by her own firmness, everything that nature had left out of him. He needed a wife, in short, exactly like the grave and capable Princess May of Teck. There is something poignant when you stop to feel it in being chosen for what you can do for someone else. May was not wanted in this first match for her own sake, for her wit or her looks or the pleasure of her company. She was wanted as a remedy, a steadying hand for a young man who could not steady himself, a strong frame to be set against a weak one. The family looked at her and saw above all usefulness, the very quality that her whole hard upbringing had trained into her. And she knew it, and she did not flinch from it, for she had long ago made her peace with being valued for her competence rather than her charm. It is a strange foundation for a marriage to be the cure for another person's failings, and yet she accepted it without bitterness, as she accepted most things, seeing clearly what was being asked and judging that she could give it. Whether love might have grown from such a beginning, whether the dutiful girl and the drifting prince could ever have made a true marriage of it, is one of the questions her life leaves forever unanswered, for the beginning was all there was ever to be. So the old queen made up her mind, and when Victoria made up her mind, the rest of the family arranged itself around the decision like iron filings around a magnet. The morganatic shadow that had shut so many lesser doors against May simply did not signify here, for the queen had weighed character against blood, and found character the heavier, and she wanted this steady young woman for her wavering grandson with all the force of her considerable will. May was invited to stay. She was looked over, talked to, measured against the need, and she passed every test the old queen set her. And then, late in the year 1891, at a country house called Luton Hoo, in the course of a visit arranged for exactly this purpose, Eddie asked May to marry him, and May said yes. Consider what that yes must have held inside it, because it was not a simple thing. She did not love him. She scarcely knew him. There had been no slow growth of affection, only the sudden convergence of the family's need and her own long-deferred hope. But she understood with perfect clarity what was being offered and why. After all the years of waiting, after the closed doors and the whispered pity and the slow advance of an unmarried middle age, she had been chosen, and chosen not for some minor princeling, but for the heir to the heir, the young man who would one day be king. She was to be Princess of Wales in her time, and Queen of England after that, and Empress over the vast reaches of the empire. The poor relation from the displaced household, the girl with the shadow over her name, was to be lifted in one stroke to the very summit of the world she had grown up at the edge of. If she did not love Eddie, she could pity him, and like him, and mean to do her whole duty by him, and perhaps in time, with patience, make something better of him than he could make of himself. It was the bargain her whole upbringing had prepared her for, and she took it with open eyes. The country received the news with delight, for there was a romance in it that the public could not resist. The poor but blameless princess raised up at last to the side of the future king. The newspapers told and retold her story, the displaced girlhood, the years of patient waiting, the long shadow over her birth now lifted by the favour of the old queen herself. Crowds gathered to glimpse her. Her likeness appeared in the illustrated papers. After the long quiet years at the edge of things, she found herself suddenly at the very centre of national attention, the bride-to-be of the heir, and she met that attention with the same composed dignity. She met everything, giving the public exactly the grave and gracious figure it wished to see. For a few short weeks she stood in the full warm light of her country's goodwill, the waiting over, the future bright and certain before her. It was, though she could not know it, the last untroubled happiness she would know for a long while, and it was very soon to be taken from her in the cruelest way imaginable. And she set about preparing for it, as she did everything, soberly, thoroughly, with no fuss and no illusions. The wedding was fixed for the end of February. The trousseau was ordered, the plans laid, the great machinery of a royal marriage set in motion. For a few short weeks, May allowed herself, at last, to stand inside the future she had wanted so deeply and so quietly, to believe that the waiting was over and the doubt was answered, and her life had finally swung onto the bright path it was meant for. She had earned it by years of patience and self-command. It was hers. And then, with a suddenness that no one could have foreseen, in the space of a single dreadful week, the whole of it was torn away. The doorway I promised you at the very start of this evening is just ahead now, and what waits beyond it is where we go next. That winter, a wave of influenza was moving across the country, the kind of sweeping seasonal sickness that in those years, before the medicine we now take for granted, could carry off the strong and the young as readily as the old and the frail. It came to Sandringham, the family's house out in the flat cold country of Norfolk, where they had gathered in the new year of 1892. There had been a birthday to mark, for Eddie turned 28 in the first days of January, and the house was full of family, and into the middle of that gathering the sickness crept. Eddie fell ill. At first it seemed a passing thing, the sort of feverish cold that a young man throws off in a few days of rest, and no one was greatly alarmed. But it did not pass. It settled and deepened and sank into his chest, and turned, as influenza so often did in those days, to pneumonia, that drowning of the lungs that the doctors of the time could do so little to halt. And so the house in Norfolk became, with frightening speed, a place of dread and helpless watching. The doctors came and conferred, and could offer little but cold compresses and hope. The family gathered close, his mother Alexandra scarcely leaving his side, his father grave and frightened, his sisters hovering, and May, his promised wife of a few short weeks, there among them, drawn into the very heart of a grief that was about to become the central fact of her life. She sat in that overheated sick room, or just outside its door, through the long hours, watching the young man she was to marry struggle for each breath. There was nothing she could do but be present, and steady, and quiet, which was the thing she had always been best at, and which now took on a terrible new use. While others wept and broke down, May held herself together, as she would hold herself together at every deathbed and every graveside of her long life, drawing on that deep reserve of self-command that her hard childhood had built in her. It was, perhaps, the first time the world saw what that composure was for. Think of what those days must have been, in that crowded, frightened house. The short January light at the windows, the lamps lit early, the doctors coming and going with their grave faces and their useless remedies, the family moving softly along the passages, speaking in the low voices that gather around a sick room. Outside, the flat Norfolk fields lay cold and bare under a grey sky, and inside, a young man who should have had 50 years before him fought for breath in a small overheated room. May had known him only a little while. She was not yet his wife, would never now be his wife, and yet she was bound to be there, to share the watch, to be one of the still figures keeping vigil while the hours wore down toward the worst. There is a peculiar loneliness in grieving for someone you have not had time to love, in mourning a future more than a man, and she felt it surely, though she said nothing of it then or ever. She simply stayed, and was useful, and held herself together, which was all she knew how to do, and all that anyone, in the end, can do at such a bedside. The fever climbed. Eddie grew delirious toward the end, his mind wandering, his words tumbling out, disconnected, and those around the bed could only listen and pray and wait. And then, on a January morning, with his devastated mother holding him and his father and his promised bride close at hand, Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, the young man who would one day have been king. He had been engaged to be married for 6 weeks. The wedding clothes were already being made. The date was set for the following month. And instead of a wedding, there was to be a funeral. And instead of a bride, May was now something for which the language scarcely had a word. The shock of it ran through the whole country. The heir to the heir, a young man in the prime of his life, struck down in a week by a winter sickness, and his wedding turned overnight to mourning. The newspapers filled with black borders. The crowds gathered in grief, and at the centre of the national sorrow stood a strange and lonely figure, Princess May, who was not quite a widow, for there had been no wedding, and yet was very far from free, for she had been bound to this family by the most public of promises, and was bound to them now by the deepest of shared sorrows. She had lost not only the man she was to marry, whom she had barely come to know, but the entire future that had at last been granted her, the great shining life that had been hers for a few short weeks, and was now snatched back into the dark. Everything she had waited for, everything she had earned by years of patience, dissolved in a single week like breath off a cold pane of glass, and she had to bear it as she bore everything in the open before a watching nation without the relief of any display. She had to stand at the funeral. She had to receive the condolences of the great and the humble alike. She had, hardest of all, to comfort Eddie's shattered mother, the gentle Alexandra, who had lost her firstborn son, while her own loss went unspoken and largely unconsidered, for who, after all, grieves most for a bride whose wedding never came? There is a particular cruelty in a sorrow that the world does not quite know how to acknowledge, and May's was exactly such a sorrow. She kept a small spray of the orange blossom that had been made for her bridal wreath, the flowers that should have crowned a wedding, and she laid them instead upon his coffin, a quiet gesture that said all she would never say aloud. And then she did what she always did, which was to gather herself, and endure, and wait, and give no sign of the wreckage within. The funeral, when it came, was a national event. The whole country plunged into mourning for the young prince struck down on the very threshold of his life. The streets were hung with black, the shops closed. The crowd stood bareheaded in the cold to watch the coffin pass, and the newspapers poured out their grief and their sympathy, much of it directed at the tragic young bride whose wedding had turned so cruelly to a funeral. May moved through all of it with the composure that was already her armour, present at every solemn rite, supporting the family that was not quite hers, accepting the condolences of a watching nation with a quiet dignity that only deepened the public's tenderness toward her. And when the ceremonies were over, and the crowds had gone home, and the great machinery of mourning had wound down, she was left, as the bereaved always are, with the silence afterward, and with the question that silence always brings of how to live now, of what a life is for when the future it was pointed at has been taken away. She did not know the answer. She only knew how to wait, and so she waited. What was to become of her now, no one could say. And the cruelty of her position was plain to everyone who thought about it. Her whole future had been bound up in that one young man, and he was now in his grave. She was 24, marked now by tragedy as well as by birth, and it seemed entirely possible that the door which had opened so briefly had closed again forever, that she would slip back after all into the half-life she had so nearly escaped. And he sadder now, and more pitied, and harder to place than before. And yet the family that had drawn her in did not let her go. Slowly, quietly, in the careful way of such people, they began to turn over a thought that would have seemed strange and even shocking had it not arisen out of so much shared grief. For Eddie had a brother, We will come to it in a moment. His name was George, and he was the second son, the younger brother who had spent his whole life so far in Eddie's shadow and entirely without Eddie's prospects. In almost every way he was his brother's opposite. Where Eddie had been languid and dreamy and soft, George was brisk, exact, practical, and direct. As a second son, not expected ever to reign, he had been free to choose the life that suited him, and he had chosen the sea. He had gone into the Royal Navy as a boy of 12 and given himself to it body and soul, learning the hard, disciplined rhythm of a sailor's life, the watches and the drills and the cramped, ordered world of a ship, rising through the ranks on his own merits, happiest in a service that asked of him exactly the plain, dutiful steadiness that was his nature. He was short and upright, and a little gruff, with a sailor's bluntness and a sailor's love of routine, a man who liked his days ship-shape and his hours laid out in advance, and could not abide fuss or affectation, or anything out of its proper place. He had never wanted a throne. He had wanted a quarter-deck, and he had assumed with quiet contentment that the navy would be his whole future. His brother's death changed everything in an instant. With Eddie gone, George was no longer the spare second son free to follow the sea. He was now the heir after his father, the young man on whom the future of the throne had suddenly come to rest. The navy would have to be given up. The carefree independence would have to end. Almost at once, with Eddie barely in his grave, the same anxious family logic that had selected May for the elder brother began, very gently and very carefully, to turn itself toward the younger. For here was an arithmetic that to our ears can sound cold to the point of cruelty, and that to the people who lived it felt like something closer to Providence. May had been chosen by the old queen herself as precisely the right wife for the future king. That sovereign was now a different young man, but the rightness of the choice had not changed in the slightest. The qualities that would have steadied Eddie would steady George just as well. The suitable bride was still suitable. Why, the family began quietly to ask itself, should she be lost? And what of George himself in all of this? The brisk young sailor suddenly hauled out of the life he loved and pointed toward a throne he had never wanted, and a bride his dead brother had chosen first. It cannot have been simple for him either. He was a shy man, awkward with women, more comfortable on a deck among his fellow officers than in any drawing room, and he found himself now expected to court, of all people, the very woman the family had picked for Eddie, under the eyes of his grieving parents and the watching nation. That he managed it at all says something about him, and that he managed it so well, turning a delicate, almost impossible situation into the great love of his life, says a great deal more. For George, beneath the gruffness and the rigid habits, was a man of deep and simple loyalties, and once his heart attached itself, it did not waver. He came to need May with a completeness that would have surprised anyone who saw only his stiff public manner, and he told her so again and again in the private language of their letters. The arrangement the family had made for its own convenience became, for the two people inside it, something neither of them had expected, and both of them came to depend upon. We should pause on how strange and delicate that idea was, because it would be easy to judge it harshly and wrong to do so. To take the grieving almost widow of the elder brother and match her to the younger can look, from the outside, like a cold reshuffling of assets, a dynasty refusing to waste a useful piece. But that is not how it felt from within, and the reason is grief itself. George and May had not come to each other as strangers making a calculated bargain. They had come to each other through the same loss, through the death of the same beloved young man, having stood at the same bedside and the same graveside, and wept, in their separate reserved ways, for the one young man they had both lost. They knew each other's sorrow from the inside, as almost no one else on earth could. And out of that shared sorrow slowly, without anything being said too soon, a real and tender understanding began to grow between them. It was not a sudden romance. It was something quieter and in the end sturdier. Two reserved and dutiful people, bruised by the same blow, discovering by degrees that they suited one another remarkably well. It grew, that understanding, in the slow, undramatic way of things that last. They were thrown together by the family and by the shared work of grief, and they found, meeting and writing across the long months of mourning, that they were easy in each other's company, that the silences between them were comfortable rather than awkward, that each supplied something the other wanted. He admired her steadiness and her sense, the very qualities his brother had lacked. She found in his blunt naval directness, his loyalty, his freedom from the affectation she despised, a man she could respect and rely upon. Neither was given to grand declarations. Both were happiest in the plain and the practical. But out of all that plainness a real attachment took shape, unhurried and deep-rooted, the kind that does not blaze up and burn out, but settles in for a lifetime. By the time he asked her, in that garden at Sheen, the answer was never truly in doubt, for they had already, in the quiet way that suited them both, become necessary to one another. And it was not rushed, which is to the credit of everyone concerned. More than a year was allowed to pass between the death and any word of an engagement, a long and proper interval of mourning that gave the thing time to become real, rather than merely arranged. During that year there was a fright of its own, for George fell seriously ill with typhoid fever, the same disease that had nearly killed his grandfather, the Prince Consort's old enemy, decades before. And for a time the family that had just buried one son feared it might lose another. May was among those who waited and worried through his illness, and he recovered, and the shared anxiety of it seems only to have drawn them closer. They wrote to one another, they met and talked, and found the understanding between them deepening into something warmer. And in the early summer of 1893, in the garden of a house at Sheen belonging to George's sister, he asked May to marry him, and on this occasion the yes she gave was given not to a near stranger chosen for her by others, but to a living man whom she was already coming, in her quiet way, to love. The relief and the gladness that swept through the family were enormous, and the country shared in them. The newspapers that had draped themselves in black for the tragic bride a year before now rejoiced over the happy one, and the public, which had taken May to its heart in her sorrow, took her to its heart again in her good fortune. There was something in the whole story that moved people. The patient, dignified young woman who had borne so cruel a loss so bravely, restored now to the great destiny that had seemed lost with Eddie, and restored, what is more, to a man she could respect and grow to love, which is more than a great many royal brides of that hard age could ever have dreamed of. The shadow over her birth was, by this second engagement, all but dissolved, whatever the strict accountants had once whispered about whether she was royal enough. No one would dare to whisper it now against the chosen bride of the future king. The girl from the displaced, debt-ridden household stood once more upon the threshold of the throne, and this time she would cross it. The wedding, and the strange, modest, surprisingly happy marriage that followed it, is where we go next. They were married on a bright July day in 1893 in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, the old Queen herself present, and behind her the assembled royalty of half of Europe, filling the pews in their orders and their jewels. May wore white satin, and she wore again the orange blossom that had once been meant for that other wedding, the one that never came, a quiet thread of memory running through the day, and she carried herself, as she always did, with the composure that some onlookers took for coldness, and that those who knew her understood for what it was. the discipline of a woman who felt deeply and showed little. Outside the palace, the crowds of London packed the route in their tens of thousands, cheering the bride they had grieved with and now rejoiced with, the brave, dignified princess whose strange, sad story they had followed and taken to heart. It was a day of real warmth and real gladness, and at the heart of it stood a young woman who had travelled an extraordinary distance to reach it, from the Lent rooms and the unpaid bills and the continental exile, from the closed doors and the whispered pity, all the way to the chapel royal as the bride of the future king. And yet, for all the brightness of the day, there must have been a quieter current running beneath it, felt most of all by the bride. For she had stood at this threshold once before, in the weeks before another wedding that never came, and the orange blossom she carried had first been gathered for that one. The man beside her now was the brother of the man she had first been promised to, and the great occasion they were sharing had been made possible only by a death. None of this was spoken, of course. It was not the kind of thing that her world or her own nature allowed to be spoken. But it was there, woven into the satin and the flowers and the cheering, the strange truth that her happiness had been built on the foundation of a tragedy, that she had reached this height by a road no one would ever have chosen. She bore it as she bore everything, without a flicker, smiling for the crowds, perfectly composed. But it would be a mistake to imagine she did not know exactly what she carried, or to think that the grave stillness of her wedding face held nothing behind it. It held a great deal. It always did. What none of the cheering thousands could have foreseen was how very well this marriage, arranged out of grief and dynastic need, would actually turn out, not merely as an alliance of houses, which it certainly was, but as a true and lasting union of two human beings. George and May were not, and never would be, romantic in any way the world could see. They were both deeply shy of open feeling, both far more at ease with duty and routine than with tenderness spoken aloud, and in public they often appeared stiff and formal with one another, a husband and wife who rarely touched, who seldom exchanged a smile for the onlookers, who seemed, to those who did not know them, almost cool. But the public stiffness hid a private truth, and the private truth is written plainly in the letters they wrote to each other across the next 40 years, letters that survive and that tell a story their public faces never told. There on paper, where they could say what they could not say face to face, the two reserved people poured out a real and growing devotion, George confessing again and again how utterly he depended on her, how lost he was without her, how she had become the steady centre of his whole existence, and May answering with a loyalty and a warmth that never once, across all those years, faltered or failed. He never strayed, which, for a prince of that family and that pleasure-loving age, was itself a quiet marvel and a measure of what she meant to him. His own father had kept mistresses and lived for amusement. George wanted only his wife, his children, his stamp collection, and the ordered domestic peace that May made for him. And she, for her part, gave him an absolute and unwavering support, subordinating her own considerable judgment and her own strong tastes to his, smoothing his way, steadying his moods, standing beside him through every trial that the years would bring. It was not an equal partnership in the modern sense. She deferred to him in nearly everything, as a wife of her time and station was expected to, and she swallowed a great deal of her own self in the deferring. But it was a real partnership for all that, built of mutual need and mutual respect, and a love that deepened rather than faded with the decades, and it would prove, in the storms that lay ahead, one of the strongest things in either of their lives. They had been brought together by a death and an arrangement, and they made of it one of the great marriages ever to sit upon the English throne. They began that married partnership quietly, as they meant to go on, with a honeymoon spent not in some glamorous foreign retreat, but at the modest house on the Sandringham estate that would become their home, the two of them setting up their shared existence in the plain, unshowy style that suited them both. From the very first, they fell into the steady domestic rhythm that would shape the next 4 decades, the early hours and the ordered days, the quiet evenings, the deep mutual reliance that grew with every passing season. He brought her his loyalty and his need. She brought him her judgment and her calm. Neither asked of the other what the other could not give. There were no grand passions in it, no storms, none of the drama that fills the marriages of more glittering couples. There was instead something rarer and more durable, 2 people who suited one another exactly, who grew over the years so closely intertwined that it became impossible to imagine the one without the other. It was the central fact of both their lives, that plain strong marriage and everything else they did and became rested upon it. And so the long second act of May's life began, the act in which she would slowly cease to be the doubtful, poor relation and become by patient degrees the indispensable wife of a king. But that transformation was a slow one, and its early years were lived not in the splendour you might imagine, but in a setting of almost comical modesty, a setting that tells you a great deal about the strange, narrow, oddly small domestic world that this future king and queen chose to make for themselves. For when George and May set up house together as a married couple, the home they took up was not a palace at all. It was a cramped and dark little villa, tucked into the grounds of his father's estate, so plain and so poky that visitors could scarcely believe the heir to the throne and his wife actually lived in it. That little house, and the curious confined life they led within it, and the watchful, dominating shadow of his parents that fell across all of it, is where we go next. The house was called York Cottage, for George was made Duke of York upon his marriage, and it stood in the grounds of Sandringham, that same Norfolk estate where Eddie had died, only a short walk across the park from the great main house where George's parents reigned over their own establishment. It had begun life as a kind of overflow lodge for the bachelor guests of the big house, and it had the cramped, dark, awkward character of a building that was never meant to be a proper home. The rooms were small and badly lit, crowded close together, with poky windows and low ceilings, and none of the space or grandeur that you would suppose a future king and queen to require. The grounds outside were pleasant enough, but the house itself was, by any honest reckoning, a thoroughly inconvenient and unlovely place, more like the residence of a comfortable country doctor or a prosperous solicitor than the home of the heir to the British throne. And George loved it with all his heart, and would hear not a word against it, and would live in it, by choice, for the better part of 30 years. You can understand his attachment if you remember the sailor in him. The cramped quarters and the plain fittings and the ordered smallness of the place suited the man who had been happiest in the close confines of a ship. He did not want grandeur, he wanted comfort and routine and the familiar, and York Cottage gave him all 3. He filled it with his guns and his stamp albums and the heavy dark furniture he liked. He kept its clocks and its habits to a rigid schedule, and within its narrow walls he was, by his own simple standards, perfectly content. For May, it was a far more complicated thing to live in, and there is a real poignancy in her situation that is easy to miss beneath the surface of a happy marriage. For remember what she was. She was a woman of deep cultivation and exact taste, who had taught herself in the galleries of Florence to know the fine from the second-rate, who understood as few people did how a room should be composed and how a house should express the dignity of those who lived in it. And here she was, mistress of a dark little villa where the furnishings had been chosen by other hands and her husband's contentment forbade their being changed, where her own knowledge and her own eye counted for almost nothing against his placid insistence that everything was quite all right as it was. She did not complain. Complaint was not in her, and she had learned long before, in her father's house, to swallow her own preferences in the service of peace and duty. But there is something quietly affecting in the picture of that particular, knowledgeable, beauty-loving woman making her home year after year after year in a house she would never have chosen, beside a husband she would not for the world contradict, surrendering her own strong tastes to his so completely that an outsider would never have guessed she had any. It was the same self-subordination she practiced in everything, the same swallowing of her own self that her whole life seemed to ask of her. And it was real, and it cost her something, even if she would never have dreamed of saying so. Their days in that little house ran to a pattern so fixed that you could almost have set a watch by it. George rose early, and dealt with his correspondence and his shooting, and above all his stamp, for he was a serious and devoted collector of them, hunched for hours over his albums with a magnifying glass, building one of the finest collections in the world out of small squares of coloured paper. May had her own pursuits, her reading and her needlework, and her own quieter collecting, and she ran the household with the smooth efficiency she brought to everything. In the evenings they sat together, often in near silence, two people who did not need to fill the air with talk, comfortable in each other's company in the way of a couple who have grown into the shape of one another. To an outsider it might have looked dull, even a little sad, this narrow domestic round in a cramped dark house. To the two of them it was exactly what they both wanted, a refuge of order and quiet at the still centre of a life that would grow with the years ever more public and more demanding. The smallness of York Cottage was, in its way, the thing that made the largeness of everything else endurable. And over the cramped domestic life of York Cottage there fell another, heavier shadow, the shadow of George's parents, just across the park. The Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, was a large, genial, immensely dominating man, accustomed to having his family revolve around him, and George, the dutiful son, revolved without a murmur. The young couple's whole life was arranged to suit the pleasure of the old people in the big house. They lived where they were told to live. They came when they were summoned. They fell in with the elaborate, unchanging round of shooting parties and dinners and country amusements that the Prince of Wales loved, their days dictated by his tastes and their movements by his wishes. And May, who had clear and excellent ideas of her own about how a household should be run and how children should be raised, found those ideas overruled at every turn, both by the sheer weight of a court that was not yet hers and by her formidable, fashionable mother-in-law Alexandra, who was loving but possessive, and who kept her grown sons and their families bound tightly to herself. May handled Alexandra with the same patient tact she brought to every difficulty, never challenging, never complaining, simply waiting and deferring and quietly enduring the older woman's possessive hold over the family. It cannot have been easy. Alexandra was beautiful and charming and beloved. Everything May was not, and she kept her son's George above all, tied to her with bonds of devotion that left little room for a daughter-in-law's authority. May's children were partly raised under their grandmother's eye, her household partly ordered by her mother-in-law's wishes, her own place in the family forever, a step below the woman who would not loosen her grip. A lesser character might have fought, or sulked, or let the resentment show. May did none of these things. She bided her time, as she had bided it all her life, knowing that time was on her side, that the day would come when she would be mistress in her own right, and that, until it came, the wisest course was the one she had practised since girlhood, to keep her own counsel, hold her tongue, and wait. So May in these years was a wife, and soon a mother, but she was not yet mistress of her own affairs, nor anything close to it. She was a junior player in someone else's establishment, deferring to her husband, deferring to his parents, holding her tongue, biding her time, storing away a patience that must, beneath that smooth, still surface, have run very deep indeed. And yet she was not idle, and she was not wasting these years for all their frustrations. She was watching, always watching, learning how the great machine of the monarchy actually worked, where its power lay, how a court was run and how a queen behaved, gathering the knowledge that would one day, when at last her own turn came, make her one of the most capable consorts the throne had ever known. The waiting was long, and the cottage was dark, and her own self was folded away out of sight. But she was preparing, in the only way open to her, for the great part she would one day be called to play. And in the meantime, in those cramped upper rooms, the next generation of the dynasty was being born. And so her story turns that the children came quickly, as children did in those days, and in number. In the first summer of the marriage, almost exactly a year after the wedding, the eldest was born, a son they christened Edward, but always called David within the family, the boy who would one day be king, and then, in a turn no one could have imagined, lay the crown down again. A year and a half after him came a second son, Albert, called Bertie, a delicate, nervous, highly strung little boy who stammered and shrank and seemed to everyone the least promising of the brood, and who would one day, against every expectation in the world, grow into a king his country came to love. Then a daughter, Mary, named for her mother, then 2 more sons, Henry and George, and last of all, in the early years of the new century, a 6th child, another boy named John. 6 children in a little over a decade, a whole crowded nursery of small lives, the future of a dynasty taking shape under the low roof of that cramped Norfolk house. You might suppose that a house full of children would have softened the formal life of York Cottage into warmth and laughter, and in some measure, no doubt, it did. But the way that George and May raised their children is one of the saddest threads in the whole of their story, and one that has to be told honestly, because it casts a long shadow forward over the lives of those children and over the history of the throne itself. They were not, by the measure of any age, warm or easy parents. George, the old sailor, believed in discipline above all things, and he ran his nursery very much as he might have run the lower deck of a ship, with strictness, with rigid rules, with a loud and frightening temper that could reduce a small child to tears and a worse stammer in an instant. He genuinely cared for his sons and daughter, in his way, and he genuinely terrified them, and he never seemed able to grasp that the two things could not comfortably share a single house. He demanded that they be obedient, punctual, neat, silent, and brave, and when they fell short, as small children do, he told them so in a voice none of them ever forgot. The boys grew up loving and dreading him in equal measure, and the dread left marks that some of them carried to the end of their days. And here is the hardest part, the part that touches May most nearly and most painfully. She, who was by nature gentler than her husband, more thoughtful, more understanding, who might have softened all this and shielded her children from the worst of it, did not. This is the central and unhappy truth of her motherhood, and it would be wrong to look away from it. She loved her children in her contained and dutiful fashion, but she could not, or would not, place herself between them and their father's harshness. The same armour she had forged in her own difficult childhood, the same fierce self-command and devotion to duty and horror of any scene, now stood like a wall between her and her own small sons and daughter. She was reserved where they hungered for tenderness, correct where they longed for comfort, physically present in the house, and yet somehow always just beyond reach. She found it hard to take a child onto her lap, hard to say the warm and foolish loving things that children need to hear, hard to be anything other than dignified and a little distant even with her own babies. It was not, we should be clear, a coldness of the heart. The feeling was there. It was the showing of it that she could not manage, the same incapacity for open warmth that made her seem stiff in public and that had been bred into her by a lifetime of holding herself in. And there was, too, the iron rule of her marriage, which placed loyalty to George above everything, so that even when she saw him being too hard on the children, she would not undermine him, would not interfere, would not break the united front. She subordinated her own maternal instincts to her husband's authority exactly as she subordinated her tastes to his and herself to her sense of duty, and the cost of that subordination was paid in part by her children, who grew up remembering a mother who was kind but unreachable, who could discuss their lessons but not fold them in her arms. Years later, grown men, more than one of them would speak of it with a quiet, lifelong ache. It is the great flaw at the centre of her, the place where the very strength that made her magnificent made her, as a mother, a disappointment, and it ought to stand in the picture beside all her virtues, for it is as true as they are. And yet we should be fair to her even here, for she was a woman of her time as much as a person in her own right, and her time did not ask mothers of her class to be the warm hands-on presences we now expect. Children of the aristocracy and royalty were raised largely by nurses and tutors and governesses, brought to their parents for an hour in the day and returned to the nursery, loved in a formal and distant fashion that was simply the custom of the world she lived in. May was not a cold exception to a warm rule. She was, if anything, a particularly reserved example of a generally chilly arrangement. She had, besides, been mothered herself by a woman all warmth and no order, and had perhaps learned to distrust the very softness she could not supply, to associate open affection with the chaos she had spent her life fleeing. None of this undoes the hurt her children felt, the ache that some of them carried always. But it places it. She did not withhold love because she lacked it. She withheld the showing of it because she had never been taught how, and because everything in her station and her history pressed her toward restraint, and because the one lesson she had learned above all others was that feelings, let loose, led to ruin. It was a tragedy of a quiet and ordinary kind, the kind that passes down through families without anyone meaning the smallest harm. And what became of those children is one of the strange and striking things about her story, for that chilly nursery in the cramped Norfolk house produced a remarkable harvest. The eldest, the charming and wayward David, would inherit the throne and then throw it away for love, the great wound of her old age. The second, the stammering, overlooked Bertie, would take up the crown his brother dropped and grow, against every early expectation, into one of the best-loved kings the country ever had. The daughter would become a hard-working princess in the family tradition, and the surviving younger sons would do their dutiful royal work, though one of them too would die before his mother, killed in the second of her wars. It is a curious thing to look at the small, frightened children of that strict nursery and know what waited for each of them. The crowns and the abdications and the early deaths, the whole drama of a dynasty written already, unseen, in those small upturned faces. Their mother shaped them, for good and ill, more than she ever knew, and lived to see nearly all of it unfold, the triumphs and the tragedies alike, with the same unbreakable composure she brought to everything. So the children grew, in that strict and loving and chilly nursery, shaped by a father they feared and a mother they could not quite reach, and the consequences of that upbringing would echo down the decades, into abdications and reluctant kingships and private unhappiness that no one in those early years could foresee. But the world beyond the nursery was about to change, and to change everything, for the great fixed point of the whole age, the old queen who had reigned since before almost anyone could remember, was nearing the end of her long, long life. Her passing would lift George and May another step toward the throne, and begin the slow turning of May from the dutiful daughter-in-law of a cramped Norfolk cottage into the magnificent public figure that history would remember. That turning, and the great reign that lay beyond it, is where we go next. In the first cold weeks of the new century's opening winter, the immovable fixed point of the whole age was at last removed. Queen Victoria had reigned for more than 60 years, time enough that scarcely a soul alive could remember the world before her, so many seasons that she had ceased to seem quite mortal, and had become instead a kind of permanence, a presence as settled and unquestionable as the seasons. And then, in January of 1901, an old and failing woman in a house by the sea on the Isle of Wight, she died, with her children and grandchildren gathered close about her bed, and the age that carried her name was over. The shock of it ran through the country like cold water, through the veins. People who had never in their lives known another monarch wept openly in the streets, feeling the ground of the world shift under them. And in that single passing, every figure in the royal family moved one great step nearer the centre, for George's father was now the king, and George himself was now the heir apparent, and May, the poor relation with the shadow over her name, stood all at once but one place from the throne. The genial, pleasure-loving Prince of Wales, who had waited almost 60 years for his inheritance, became King Edward VII, and George, the second son who had never expected any of it, became the heir, with all the weight and visibility that the position carried. For May, the change of station was profound, though her character did not alter in the least. She remained exactly what she had always been, careful, composed, dutiful, only now upon a far larger and brighter stage. And that larger stage carried her almost at once farther from home than she had ever been in her life, on a journey that would do more than anything before it, to draw the private, watchful woman out into the open and reveal her to herself and to the world as a public figure of real power. For one of the new king's first decisions was to send his son and his son's wife on a great voyage around the globe. The purpose was both grand and practical. Out at the far rim of the world, the scattered Australian colonies had just bound themselves together into a single new nation, and the Crown wished to mark that birth in person, to send a royal prince and his wife the whole long way across the oceans to open the first Parliament of the new Commonwealth of Australia, and to show the face of the monarchy through the vast sprawl of the empire on the way. And so, for the better part of a year, George and May sailed away from England, leaving their small children behind in others' care, and made an enormous circuit of the earth, through the Mediterranean, and on by way of Ceylon and Singapore to Australia and New Zealand, and home at last, around Africa and across to Canada. It was a journey such as very few people of that age ever made, and for May it was nothing short of a revelation. For something happened to her out on those wide waters, and in those strange far ports, and before those vast cheering colonial crowds, something that everyone around her remarked upon at the time. She came into herself, released from the cramped cottage and the watchful in-laws and the narrow round of the home court, set down instead at the very centre of one great public occasion after another, where her natural dignity and her perfect composure were precisely what the moment required. May discovered that she was good at this, deeply and powerfully good at it. The very stillness that could look like coldness in a Norfolk drawing room became, on a public stage, a thing of genuine majesty. She stood through the longest ceremonies without a flicker of fatigue or impatience, She received the endless presentations with a grave and flawless courtesy. She represented her country and her husband's crown before the peoples of half the world, and she did it superbly, and she knew that she did it, and the knowledge gave her a quiet, settled confidence she would never again lose. Picture some of what she saw on that long circuit of the globe, for it was a procession of scenes such as few people of any age have witnessed. The white heat of Malta and the harbours crowded with shipping, the temples and the elephants of Ceylon, the raw new cities of Australia, decked out in bunting to receive her, where she opened the first parliament of a nation that had not existed when she was born, the green hills of New Zealand, and the vast empty spaces of Canada, the endless receptions, the addresses of welcome, the faces upturned in their thousands wherever the royal party passed. For a woman who had spent her girlhood in borrowed rooms and her early marriage in a dark little house, it was an opening out of the world on a scale almost beyond imagining, and she met it with a composure that never once cracked. Wherever she went she gathered too, in her quiet, acquisitive way, gifts and curiosities and impressions, storing them up, for she was incapable of passing through anywhere without wanting to keep some piece of it. She came home heavier with experience and surer of herself, having learned the one lesson that the cottage could never have taught her, that she was equal to the very largest stage the world could set, and that the throne, when it came, would not find her wanting. She came home too, with the first stirrings of the great purpose that would shape the rest of her days. All across the empire she had been given gifts, and had bought and gathered things with the sharp collector's eye she had trained so long ago in Florence, and she had begun to look at the scattered, neglected possessions of her own royal family with a new and serious attention. So much had been lost over the careless generations, sold off, given away, muddled and dispersed through a dozen palaces, with no one keeping any proper account of it, and May began to think, even then, that someone ought to gather it all up, to learn what belonged to the crown, and where it had gone, and how it might be brought home and set in order. It was the same instinct that had steadied her as a frightened child, the conviction that beautiful made things could be saved and kept and handed on, grown now towards something like a mission. We will come to where that mission led. For the moment, the travellers returned to England in the autumn, and the king set the seal on his son's new standing by creating George and May the Prince and Princess of Wales, the very titles that the dead Eddie and his lost bride were never to hold. She had reached at last the place she had been promised by two different brothers, across 10 long years, and from that height she would watch the confident old world she had been raised in begin its slow march toward the edge of an abyss. That is where this evening takes us. For the better part of the next decade, May lived in the particular and curious station of the heir's wife, the woman waiting in the wings while another wore the crown. Her father-in-law reigned as Edward VII, a popular and worldly king who loved society and pleasure and the company of clever, fashionable, amusing people, and who presided over a court that glittered as it had not glittered since before the old Queen's long retreat into mourning. It was a brilliant, fast, rather frivolous world, full of grand house parties, and racing, and rich food, and beautiful women, and it was not, in truth, May's world at all. She had no taste for frivolity, did not gamble or flirt or chase amusement, and found the loose, indulgent tone of her father-in-law's circle faintly distasteful, though she was far too disciplined ever to say so. She kept instead to her own grave and dignified path through the middle of it, doing her duty, supporting her husband, and quietly biding her time. The contrast between Mary and the glittering set that surrounded her father-in-law could hardly have been sharper, and she felt it keenly, though she was far too well schooled to let the feeling show. Edward VII loved beautiful, witty, fashionable women, the kind who sparkled at his card tables and his racecourses and his weekend parties, and Mary was none of those things. She was grave where they were gay, careful where they were reckless, plainly and deliberately old-fashioned in an age that prized the modern and the smart. Some of the fast set found her stiff, even dull, and no doubt let it be known. She bore their condescension as she bore everything, without retaliation and without apparent notice, secure in the knowledge of her own worth, and serenely indifferent to the opinion of people she did not respect. She had no wish to shine in that brilliant, frivolous world. She meant to do something better than shine, which was to last. And she understood, as the sparklers around her did not, that the qualities the moment overlooked were exactly the qualities the throne would one day need. But she was not idle in those waiting years, and she was certainly not standing still. She was studying, always with the patient seriousness that was her nature, mastering the workings of the monarchy from the inside, reading deeply in history and in the Constitution, learning the fine grammar of ceremony and precedence, coming to understand the great machine of the crown as few consorts ever troubled to do. She and George travelled again on the crown's business, most notably on a long journey to India, where she saw with her own eyes the immense jewelled spectacle of British rule across that ancient land, and stored away impressions that would matter greatly only a few years later. She pressed on with her collecting and her patient recovery of the royal possessions, and above all, she drew ever closer to her husband, the two of them growing steadily more dependent upon one another, a sober, devoted, old-fashioned couple, at the still centre of a restless and brilliant court. Some at that court found them dull. The wiser onlookers studied the steadiness of the marriage and the seriousness of the long preparation, and understood that when the day came, the throne would pass into careful and trustworthy hands. Those years as Princess of Wales were, in a sense, the last act of her apprenticeship, and she used them as she had used every interval of waiting in her life, to make herself ready. She read the state papers her husband was now shown, and formed her own shrewd judgments upon them. She perfected the art of the public appearance, the slow procession through a hospital or a charity bazaar, the gracious word, the unflagging attention, until she could carry a long day of ceremony without the smallest visible fatigue. She studied the people around the throne and learned who could be trusted and who could not, and she deepened, all the while, the great private work of recovering and ordering the royal possessions, so that by the time she came to the throne herself she knew more about what the crown owned, and where it was, and what it was worth, than anyone living. None of this was glamorous, and none of it drew much notice at the time. But it was the patient laying of a foundation, and when the weight of the crown finally came down upon her, the foundation held, because she had spent the long years of waiting building it stone by careful stone, and the day came sooner than anyone had supposed. The old king's health, worn down by years of rich living and heavy smoking, began to give way, and in the spring of 1910, after a run of bronchial attacks, Edward VII died, and George, the second son who had never expected the throne, the sailor who had once dreamed only of a quiet life at sea, was King of Great Britain and Ireland and Emperor of India. And May, the girl with the morganatic shadow, the bride of a dead prince, the patient and self-effacing daughter-in-law of the cramped Norfolk cottage, was queen. 43 years she had travelled to reach that word, from the lent apartment where she was born not quite royal enough to matter, through the exile and the debts and the closed doors, through the loss of one promised husband and the winning of his brother, through the long deferential seasons in the dark little house, she had come at last to the summit she had been pointed toward, and then so nearly denied. And she was ready for it as few have ever been ready, for she had spent her whole life in preparation, studying the part, mastering its smallest demands, building in herself by sheer will the dignity and command that the office required. Where another woman raised so suddenly might have faltered, May simply stepped into her destiny as though she had been waiting at its door, which in truth she had. The crown that came down upon her brought no fear, no sense of inadequacy, only the quiet satisfaction of a long apprenticeship completed. She had made herself, across 43 patient years, into exactly the queen the throne required, and now, at last, she was free to be her, and the throne would test her almost at once, for these were not quiet years in which to begin a reign. The country was restless and uncertain, shaken by hard quarrels at home and by the first far-off tremors of the catastrophe to come, and more than once in those opening seasons the new king found himself drawn toward political storms that a monarch would far rather have stood well clear of. It was not a gentle inheritance. George leaned on Mary through all of it, as he leaned on her through everything, drawing on her steadiness and her shrewd, unflustered sense, and she gave him exactly what he needed, the quiet certainty of a partner who did not panic and did not waver. The early reign was a hard apprenticeship in kingship for a man who had never wanted to be king, and he came through it because he did not face it alone. Whatever the troubles of that early reign, the two of them met them together, and the meeting of them deepened still further the partnership on which everything else would rest. She marked the change with one small, deliberate telling act, a decision about her own name. All her life the family had called her May, and many of her relations would go on calling her so in private, to the very end. But May was a nursery name, soft and girlish, and it would not do for the consort of a king. So she set it quietly aside for her public life, and took up instead the grandest of her many christened names, and became, to her people, and to history, Queen Mary. It was a tiny thing, and it was entirely characteristic of her, this deliberate folding away of the private, and the girlish in favour of the dignified and the royal. She understood, as few have ever understood so completely, that a sovereign and a sovereign's consort are no longer wholly private persons, that they must become, in some measure, symbols, subduing the ordinary self to the great office they are called to fill. She had been preparing for exactly this across all her days. Now, in her early 40s, grave and magnificent and utterly composed, she stepped into the role she had been so long and so painfully shaped for, and she would not falter in it for a single day across the quarter of a century to come. The new reign opened in mourning, and amid storms, for these were uneasy years, with bitter quarrels raging over the powers of the House of Lords, trouble deepening in Ireland, unrest spreading through the factories and the coalfields, and far off across the Channel, the slow, almost invisible gathering of a catastrophe that no one had yet learned to fear. Into all of it George and May came as deliberately steadying figures, two sober, dutiful, unglamorous people, offering their anxious country the reassurance of their very plainness, the comfort of a crown that promised nothing exciting and only to endure. It was exactly the note the age required, and they struck it without effort, because it was the truth of who they were. But before the storms broke in earnest, there was first one great and shining moment to be lived, the most magnificent spectacle of their whole lives, when they would be crowned at home and then crowned again in almost unimaginable splendour on the far side of the world. That is where we go next. In the high summer of 1911, in the grey ancient abbey at Westminster, where the sovereigns of England have been hallowed and crowned for the better part of 1,000 years, George V and Queen Mary were anointed and crowned together before the assembled great ones of the realm. It was the kind of ceremony that this country performs better than anywhere on earth, slow and solemn and freighted with the weight of centuries, the old words spoken, the holy oil applied, the heavy jewelled crowns lowered onto the two bowed heads. Mary, robed and still and shining, played her part with a grandeur that left a deep mark on every soul who witnessed it. She had a gift, now fully come into its own, for the bearing of great occasions, for standing motionless beneath the weight of a crown and a velvet train and the eyes of the watching world without the smallest sign of strain or weariness. Where others fidgeted and flagged, she seemed carved of something finer and harder, a queen out of an old painting stepped down into the living day. The country took her to its heart that day in a new way, and saw, perhaps for the first time, what manner of consort it had gained. Here was no frivolous beauty, no fashionable ornament of a court, but a grave and commanding presence, who looked every inch the part she was now to play, who wore the weight of an ancient office, as though she had been born to carry it. There was a reassurance in the very sight of her, in her straight back and her unmoving calm and the deliberate, old-fashioned dignity of her bearing, that the watching crowds responded to without quite being able to say why. In an age that was beginning, even then, to feel uncertain of itself, she looked like something that would not change, would not waver, would not let go. It was an impression she would confirm again and again across the long reign to come, and it began here in the Abbey, with a woman standing perfectly still beneath a crown, while a nation looked on and felt, obscurely, that it was in safe hands. But the crowning in the Abbey, splendid as it was, proved only the first half of the story, for George had resolved upon something no reigning king and queen of England had ever done before. He would go in person to India, the great jewel of his empire, and there, before the assembled rulers of that ancient land, show himself to his Indian subjects as their crowned emperor. And so, in the winter of that same year, the king and queen sailed for India and made their way up to the old imperial city of Delhi, where they had been raised, across a wide, dusty plain outside the walls, a gathering of overwhelming scale and deliberate magnificence, a durbar, an assembly of princes and soldiers and spectators beyond counting. There, beneath the winter sun, before tens of thousands of troops drawn up in their ranks, and the ruling princes of India in all their jewelled splendour, the King-Emperor and his Queen appeared upon a high canopied platform, robed and crowned, and were proclaimed to the vast multitude. A special crown had been made for the occasion, for by ancient custom the hallowed crown of England may not leave the country, and so a new imperial crown was fashioned, set with many thousands of diamonds and other precious stones, to rest upon the king's head in India. Mary stood at his side in her own robes and jewels, grave and glittering, as much a part of the spectacle as he was. No description quite captures the scale of that gathering, the largest assembly of its kind the world had ever seen. The plain outside Delhi had been transformed into a vast tented city, miles of it, to house the princes and the troops and the multitudes who came to witness the proclamation. There were elephants in their painted splendour, and ranks of cavalry, and the rulers of the Indian states in robes stiff with gold and gems, each come to make his obeisance before the distant emperor who had crossed the oceans to be seen. And at the centre of it all, upon the high platform beneath the canopy, sat the king and his queen, two figures from a damp grey northern island set down amid the heat and colour and immensity of the east, embodying for one shining afternoon a dominion that stretched across a quarter of the globe. Mary took it in with her collector's eye and her historian's mind, knowing exactly what she was looking at, knowing that such a scene could not come again, storing it away among the treasures of her memory. She would speak of it and think of it to the end of her days, the high noon of an empire and of her own life, the moment when the displaced girl from the Lent room sat crowned above the princes of India. And then it was over, the tent struck, the princes departed to their states, the great plain emptied of its multitudes, and the king and queen turned for home across the long sea miles. They could not have known, sailing back toward England in the early weeks of the new year, that they were leaving behind them not merely a ceremony, but an age, that the confident imperial world which had staged that vast display would, within a few short years, begin to come apart and never be put back together. The Durbar was its high noon, and high noon is the moment before the long afternoon begins. For Mary it remained always the most magnificent thing she had ever been part of, the summit of her husband's reign and of the empire he ruled. But it was a summit, and summits are followed by descent, and the descent, when it came, would be steeper and darker than anyone basking in that Indian sunlight could possibly have foreseen. It is worth pausing on this quiet evening to feel the sheer strangeness and scale of that scene, for it was the very summit of the whole imperial age, a moment that could not have happened a generation before, and would never happen again a generation after. Here was the daughter of a debt-ridden, half-royal household, the girl once judged not quite good enough to make a grand marriage, standing crowned upon a dais on a plain in northern India, while a fifth of all the people on earth were named, in that single ceremony, her husband's subjects. The height of it is almost dizzying to contemplate, and yet what the witnesses remembered most was not Mary's grandeur, but her composure, that same unbreakable stillness she carried everywhere, the sense that whatever colossal weight the occasion laid upon her, she could bear it as easily as breathing, as though she had been made for precisely this and nothing else. She gathered impressions there too, and treasures, with the collector's eye she never set aside, storing away the memory of that vast jewelled assembly to the very end of her long life. It was for her and for her husband both the brightest and most golden hour they would ever know together. And it could not last, and at some level they must both have sensed that it could not, for even as the king and queen stood crowned before the princes of India, the world that had made such a scene possible was already shifting, slowly and invisibly, toward its own undoing. Across the plains and cities of Europe, the great powers were arming, the old alliances hardening, the ancient suspicions deepening into something that within 3 short years would burst into a catastrophe such as the world had never witnessed. The golden imperial noon at Delhi was, though no one standing in that sunlight could have said so, already a kind of sunset, the last bright blaze of a confident age about to be swept away for good. When Mary came home from India, she came home to a country sliding toward the lip of the abyss, and the next great trial of her life would have nothing to do with crowns and durbars and shining ceremony. It would be a matter of blood and grief and endurance on a scale that would change the monarchy, the country, and the whole of the age, past all recognition. There our path turns next. In the late summer of 1914, the long-gathering storm broke at last, and the nations of Europe went to war. It would come to be called the Great War, and then, more terribly still, the First World War, as though it already half knew there would be another. It was a catastrophe beyond anything the people of that confident age could have imagined. A war of vast armies locked in the mud of the trenches across northern France and Belgium, a war that fed the young men of a whole generation into the machinery of slaughter, month upon month, and year upon year, until the lists of the fallen grew so long that scarcely a household in the land was left untouched by grief. And at the head of that frightened, sorrowing, embattled country stood George V and Queen Mary, summoned now to be not the shining figures of a Durbar, but the steady, sober, grieving father and mother of a people at war. Mary threw herself into the work of those years, with all the disciplined energy of her nature, and it suited her exactly. Here at last was a purpose worthy of her seriousness, a great labour of duty, in which there was no room for frivolity, and every room for the patient, organising, tireless devotion she had always had to give. She visited the hospitals, hundreds upon hundreds of them, walking the long wards among the wounded and the dying, stopping at bed after bed to speak quietly with shattered young men, never flinching from the broken bodies, never letting her composure crack before those who needed her to be strong. She organized relief on a great scale, marshalling the women of the country into work for the soldiers at the front and the families left behind. She toured the factories where women had taken up the labour the men had left, and met them, and learned their conditions. She made the monarchy useful, in a way it had seldom needed to be, turning the dignity of the crown into practical comfort and the energy of a queen into real help, and she did it without complaint and without rest, month upon weary month, as the toll of the dead climbed ever higher. And the war was not, for her, a thing kept safely at arm's length, a matter of hospital visits and public duty alone. Her own sons were of an age to serve, and serve they did, the eldest going out to the Western Front, the second seeing action at sea in the great battle that the Navy fought against the German fleet. A mother who sends her children into a war does not stop being a mother while she does her public work, and beneath the composed surface of the Queen there must have been the same cold fear that gripped every mother in the land, the same dread of the telegram, the same nightly reckoning of where her boys were and whether they were safe. She never spoke of it in those terms, never allowed the private fear to show through the public duty. But it was there, and it bound her to the women whose wards she walked, and whose factories she toured in a way that no mere royal condescension ever could have. She grieved with her people because she shared their danger, and they knew it, and it changed forever the way they felt about the throne. By the time the guns fell silent, a generation lay dead, and the country that emerged from the slaughter was sadder, poorer, and stripped of much of the easy confidence it had taken into the war. Mary had spent 4 years giving everything she had to the effort, and the effort had aged her, as it aged everyone who lived through it. But it had also revealed her, drawn out of the reserved and rather forbidding Queen, a depth of devotion, and a capacity for hard, unglamorous work that the country had not fully appreciated before. She had walked the wards, comforted the dying, organised and toured and laboured without rest, and she had done it not for show, but because she believed it was her plain duty, and the people had seen and understood and taken her at last fully to their hearts. The war that broke so much also forged, between this undemonstrative queen and the nation she served, a bond that nothing afterward would break. She had earned it the hard way in the hospital wards and the factory yards, and she would hold it to the end of her days. And in the middle of the war there came a strange crisis that touched the very name of the royal house, and Mary felt it more keenly than most, for it cut close to the bone of who she was. The enemy in this war was Germany, and the royal family of Britain was, by long descent, overwhelmingly German. Its very surname came from across the Rhine. The family held old German titles, claimed German cousins on every side, and carried German blood in every vein, and Mary herself was the daughter of a German prince, the lady from the small duchy of Teck. As the fighting ground on and a fierce hatred of all things German rose through the country, this inheritance became an unbearable embarrassment, a wound at the very heart of the monarchy that could not be left to fester. And so the king took a decision of great symbolic weight. He swept away the old foreign styles and titles, renounced them entirely, and gave to his dynasty a fresh and wholly English name, drawn from the great royal castle on the Thames. The family would be known from that day forward as the House of Windsor. Mary's own relations gave up their continental styles too, and took plain English titles in their stead. It was a shedding of an old skin, a deliberate and necessary act of becoming, in the eyes of the watching people, entirely of this country and no other. And for Mary, who had carried the faint foreignness of her father's line all her life, as one more shadow over her name, it must have held a peculiar private meaning, for the morganatic prince's daughter was now, beyond all question or whisper, a wholly English queen of a wholly English house. But there was a grief folded into that necessary act too, which she felt more sharply than most, for the war had set her against her own blood in the cruellest way. The royal houses of Europe were one great cousinhood, intermarried across the generations, and the enemy now firing across the trenches included men and women she had known and loved, relations of her own and of her husband's. On the German side of the family she could no longer acknowledge. The continent of her girlhood, the Germany of her father, the easy traffic of royal cousins back and forth across the borders, all of it was being torn apart, and many of those old ties would never be repaired. She gave up her German styles without hesitation, because duty and the temper of the country demanded it, and because she was, in her own heart, wholly English. But the giving up was also a kind of bereavement, a severing from a part of her own past, and she was too honest a woman not to have felt it as one, even as she did, without complaint. The thing that had to be done. The war ground on to its end at last, in the November of 1918, in an exhausted and grieving victory, a generation of young men dead in the mud, and the old confident order gone forever. Mary and George had come through it with their standing not lessened, but greatly enlarged, for they had shared the country's ordeal, had grieved with it and laboured for it, and stood steady at its head through its darkest passage, and the people loved them for it, as they had never quite loved them before. But the Queen's own war had carried within it a private grief as well, a sorrow that belonged not to the nation, but to her alone, a small quiet loss folded inside the great public one. For while the guns thundered across France, in a secluded house on the Sandringham estate, her youngest child had been living out the last of a short and shadowed life, hidden from the world, and his story is among the tenderest and least known in all her long history. And there we are going now. His name was John, the last of her 6 children, born in the early years of the century, and for the first part of his little life he seemed a healthy and affectionate boy. But as he grew it became clear that something was wrong. He began to suffer from epilepsy, from seizures that came more often and more severely as the years passed, and he developed, too, in ways that the doctors of that time had no good name for, and no power to help. He was, by every account, a gentle and sweet-natured child, loving and much beloved, but he could not be made to fit the rigid, disciplined, public mould into which a royal child of that family was expected to grow. And so a decision was taken, the kind of decision that was common enough in those years among families of every rank when a child was different in ways the world found difficult, and yet a decision that strikes the modern heart as almost unbearably sad. Little John was sent to live quietly apart, away from his brothers and his sister, in a farmhouse on the Sandringham estate, cared for by a devoted nurse, kept out of the public eye, screened from a world thought unable to understand him. And there, at the farmhouse on the estate, the youngest of her sons lived out his short span in a kind of gentle seclusion that was not, whatever else it was, unkind. He had his nurse, who loved him devotedly and stayed at his side to the end. He had a garden to play in, and animals to know, and the freedom, away from the rigid royal round, simply to be the affectionate, uncomplicated boy he was. Other children from the estate were brought to play with him, and there are glimpses of him happy, pottering about his small world, making his small discoveries, untroubled by the great machine of monarchy that ground on out of his sight. It was a narrowed life, and a hidden one, and our own age aches at the thought of it. But within its narrow walls there was real tenderness, real care, and a kind of peace that the relentless glare of public royalty might never have allowed him. His mother visited and grieved for him in her contained way, both before and after his end, and kept, ever afterward, a particular soft place in her guarded heart for the child she had not been able to keep among the others. It is easy and it is tempting to judge his parents harshly for this, and the temptation is worth resisting, because the truth is more complicated and more human than simple coldness. By the standards of their own time, they did what careful, well-meaning people of their class did, removing a vulnerable child from the relentless glare of royal life into a place of quiet and safety where he could be himself without strain. John was not abandoned. He was held dear and visited, and well looked after in his sheltered farmhouse, and there are accounts of his mother coming to see him, and of his being, in his protected way, a happy little boy among his gardens and his nurse. And yet there is no escaping the sorrow at the centre of it, the image of a small, different child kept apart from his family, growing up out of sight, while the vast machinery of war and monarchy ground on around him. In January of 1919, only weeks after the guns had fallen silent, John suffered a severe seizure in his sleep and died quietly in his farmhouse at the age of 13. His mother, who had borne so much in public with such unbreakable composure, grieved for her lost youngest son in the private, contained, undemonstrative way that was the only way she knew, and called his death, in a letter, a great release for the poor afflicted boy. It was the last and smallest of the war's many griefs, and it belonged to her alone. The world that came out of that war was a changed and frightening place, and the monarchy had to change with it, or perish. The great thrones of Europe had toppled one after another in the upheaval of those years. The empires of Germany and Austria and Russia swept clean away, kings and emperors who had been Mary's own cousins driven into exile, or worse. The Russian emperor, her husband's near double in looks, and his close kinsman, had been murdered with his whole family in a cellar far away to the east, a horror that struck the family in England to the heart. In country after country, the old order had simply ceased to exist. The lesson of those fallen thrones was not lost on the watchful pair at the head of the British monarchy. All across the continent, the grand, remote, glittering style of kingship that the 19th century had known was being swept into the dustbin, and the crowns that survived were, almost without exception, the ones that had learned to bend, to come closer to their people, to seem less like distant idols, and more like the steady, dutiful first family of the nation. George and Mary understood this instinctively, and it shaped the whole tenor of their reign. They made the monarchy modest, hard-working, domestic, scrupulously above politics and scandal, bound tightly to the ordinary life of the country through war and hardship alike. It was, in part, a deliberate strategy of survival. The recognition that a throne which set itself coldly above its people would, in the new age, not last. But it was also simply the expression of who they were, two plain, dutiful people who had no taste for glitter and every instinct for service. The plainness that saved the British crown was, in the end, the very plainness that the fast set had once found so dull, and Mary, who embodied it more completely than anyone, had been right all along. And so in Britain the throne stood, and no one embodied its quiet steadiness more completely than Queen Mary. In the years after the war she became, more than ever, the great fixed point of the royal family, its matriarch and its conscience, the keeper of its standards and the guardian of its dignity, the unmoving figure around whom the whole institution arranged itself. She was a formidable presence now, in her 50s and her 60s, tall and upright and magnificently turned out in the slightly old-fashioned style she had made her own, and would never abandon, the high-piled hair, the long fitted gowns, the ropes of pearls, the toque hat that grew as familiar to the country as the crown itself. She had a way of entering a room that hushed it, a gravity that could reduce prime ministers and princes alike to their most careful manners. And it was in these settled later years that the great private passion of her whole life came fully into its own, the passion for collecting and preserving, which deserves to be understood properly, because it was very far from the idle hobby of a rich old woman with time to fill. That is where we go next. To see her collecting as mere acquisitiveness, as the magpie greed of a queen who simply liked to own beautiful objects, is to miss its whole meaning. And the meaning matters, because it reaches down to the very core of who she was and of what she believed her family existed to do. Remember the frightened child in the chaotic, debt-ridden household, who had learned so painfully early that a comfortable world can simply collapse, and who had found her one true source of safety in the galleries of Florence, in the understanding that beautiful made things endure, and fine workmanship outlasts the hands that made it, that the past can be saved and kept and handed on. That childhood discovery had grown, across the whole of her life, into something very like a calling. She came to see herself as the guardian of her family's material memory, the one who would gather up what had been scattered, recover what had been lost, set in order what had fallen into confusion, and pass all of it on, complete and understood, to the generations still to come. It was preservation, not possession, that drove her, the keeping safe of a heritage she felt herself merely the custodian of Goodzench. And so she became, in the most serious sense of the word, the great curator of the crown's possessions. She hunted down royal treasures that had been sold or given away or simply mislaid across the careless generations, tracing them through dealers and sale rooms and the houses of relations, buying them back, reclaiming them, restoring them to the royal collections where she believed they belonged. She studied the histories of the objects, learning where each piece had come from and which of her ancestors had owned it, building up in her own formidable memory a vast and detailed knowledge of the family's possessions that no one before her had ever troubled to assemble. She arranged and catalogued and labelled, bringing the patience of a scholar to what had been mere accumulation, so that the things of the past should not only be kept, but be known and understood. It was in its quiet way an act of devotion to the monarchy itself, for she grasped, as few around her did, that a royal house lives partly through its things, through the unbroken thread of objects passed from hand to hand down the centuries, each one a witness to a reign and a life, and that to preserve those objects was to preserve the very memory and meaning of the crown she served. The range of what she gathered and guarded was extraordinary. There were the jewels, of course, the great historic stones and settings whose stories she knew by heart, which she would rearrange and document and wear with a deliberate sense of their meaning. There were the miniatures and the snuff boxes, the porcelain and the fans, the furniture and the family portraits, the small personal relics of ancestors long dead. She pursued things that had drifted away from the royal collections into private hands, and she had a way, not always entirely comfortable for their owners, of making her wishes known, of admiring a piece so pointedly that it found its way back to her. She knew the history of nearly everything she touched, where it had been made, and who had owned it, and how it had come to be parted from the rest. And she set it all in order, labelled and recorded and understood, so that what had been a scattered, half-forgotten accumulation became, under her patient hand, a known and ordered inheritance. It was scholarship as much as acquisition, and its true purpose was always the same, to gather up the fragments of the past before they were lost, and to hand them on whole. Those who knew her marvelled at the precision of her eye and the reach of her memory. She could enter a room and tell at a glance which objects were fine and which were not, which were genuine and which were later copies, and very often where a particular piece had come from, and which of her forebears had once owned it. She remembered things she had seen decades before, and would note on a return visit to some great house that a piece had been moved or sold or altered since her last visit, often to the discomfort of her hosts. She kept the histories of objects in her head, the way other people keep the histories of families, and in a sense that is exactly what they were to her, the family history made solid and visible, the long descent of a dynasty written in its possessions. To preserve them, to know them, to set them in order and pass them on, was to keep faith with the past, and to safeguard the meaning of the present. It was the work of a scholar and the devotion of a believer, and she gave herself to it with a seriousness that nothing else in her guarded life, save duty itself, ever quite drew from her. The most famous and most touching expression of all this was the great doll's house that was made for her in these years, a thing that people have sometimes smiled at as a grand woman's costly plaything, and that was nothing of the kind. It was conceived as a perfect miniature of an English house of its day, built to an exact small scale by one of the foremost architects of the age, and into it was poured the workmanship of hundreds of the finest makers and craftsmen in the country. Everything in it worked, and everything was real in little, the tiny taps that ran water, the small electric lamps that truly lit, the books on the library shelves written out by hand by the famous authors of the day, the miniature pictures painted by real painters, the working lifts, the stocked wine cellar, the laid-out gardens. It was a portrait in small of a whole way of living, a faithful record of English craftsmanship and English domestic life, caught at a single moment in time, made to be kept and studied and wondered at by the people of the future. When it was shown to the public, great crowds came to see it, and the money they paid went to the Queen's charities. But you must see it for what it really was, which was the same impulse that drove all the rest of her collecting, only made visible and complete in one marvellous object. It was an act of preservation. It was a determination that a moment in the life of a house, a craft, a country, should be saved entire and handed down, so that those who came after would know exactly how things had been made and lived in and cared for. Houses, memory, craftsmanship, continuity, the keeping safe of what would otherwise be lost, these were the true subjects of Queen Mary's collecting, and the doll's house was simply the perfect emblem of them, a whole world rescued from forgetting and preserved in miniature. The frightened girl who had learned that everything could vanish in a season had grown into the woman who was determined that nothing, if she could possibly help it, ever would. She had made herself the keeper of her family's past against the day when the keeping of it would matter, and that day, as it turned out, was not far off, for the steady old world she and her husband had built was about to be shaken to its very foundations. Keep that close, for it is where we are bound. The years slipped by, and George V and Queen Mary grew old together upon the throne, settling ever more deeply into the role of the nation's grave and familiar grandparents. The reign had lasted a long while now, through the war and the unease that followed it, through strikes and hardship, and the slow grinding poverty of the years between the wars, and the steady, dependable figures of the King and Queen had woven themselves into the very fabric of the country's idea of itself. In the spring of 1935, there came a great celebration, a jubilee marking 25 years since George had come to the throne, and the warmth of it took even the old king by surprise. The people poured into the streets in their hundreds of thousands, cheering the bearded, gruff old sailor and his magnificent, upright queen with a depth of affection that astonished them both. George, a modest and rather puzzled man, could not understand why the crowds should love him so. "I cannot make it out," he is said to have murmured, "for I am only an ordinary sort of fellow." But the people understood something he could not, that in an age of upheaval and toppled thrones and frightening new movements stirring abroad, this plain, dutiful, unglamorous couple stood for steadiness, for endurance, for the comforting sense that some things, at least, held firm. That Jubilee summer was in a way the reward of a whole reign of quiet faithfulness, the moment when the country looked at its sober old king and queen and discovered how much it had come to love them. The decorated streets, the bonfires on the hills, the crowds that pressed about the palace, night after night calling for them to come out onto the balcony, all of it spoke of an affection that had crept up almost unnoticed across 25 years. The affection people feel for what is steadfast and familiar and good. For Mary it must have been a deep and quiet satisfaction, the vindication of everything she had given her life to, the proof that the unshowy virtues of duty and constancy and service were not after all unnoticed or unvalued. She had never sought to be loved, only to be useful and correct. And here, in the warmth of that last summer beside her husband, she found that she had been loved all along, steadily and widely, for the very qualities she had thought of merely as her plain discharge of duty. It was as near to happiness, perhaps, as her guarded nature ever came. For the reign they had built together had quietly become something new. Without ever seeming to change, George and Mary had drawn the monarchy closer to its people than it had been in generations, until the king's own voice came into the nation's homes each Christmas over the wireless, a thing no sovereign had ever done before, the gruff old sailor speaking directly to his subjects by their firesides as though to members of one large family. That was the monarchy they had made, intimate and dutiful and domestic, a steadying presence in hard times rather than a remote glittering spectacle. It had carried the country through a world war and the bitter years that followed, and it had earned, by patient faithfulness, the deep affection that the Jubilee revealed. None of it had been accidental. It was the fruit of 2 lifetimes of unglamorous service, and Mary, who had given herself to that service without stint or complaint across a quarter of a century, could look upon what they had built and know that it was good, and that it would last beyond them both. Mary stood at his side through the Jubilee in all her grave magnificence, and it was, though no one yet knew it, very near the end. For the old king was failing. The years and the war and the cares of the reign had worn him down, and through those last months his strength ebbed quietly away. In the bleak January that followed, at Sandringham, in the flat, cold Norfolk country, where so much of their shared life had been lived, George V came to his end, slipping away with his family gathered close about him. And Mary, who had been at his side for more than 40 years, who had built her whole self around their partnership, who had grieved with him and laboured with him and stood beside him through every storm, was a widow. They had married out of duty and the wreckage of a tragedy, 2 reserved and difficult people, and they had made of it one of the great marriages of the age. Now it was over, and the still centre of her long life was gone. The grief of it went very deep, deeper than her composed surface ever betrayed. For more than 40 years he had been the fixed point of her existence, the one person to whom she had given her whole loyalty and her whole self, and without him she was for the first time since girlhood. She did not break down, of course. That was not her way, and she would no more have wept in public than she would have shouted in the street. But those close to her saw the depth of the loss in the quiet that settled over her, in the way she spoke of him, in the care with which she preserved his rooms and his things exactly as he had left them. She had built her entire existence around a partnership, and the partnership was ended, and she had now to learn, in her late 60s, how to go on as a widow, how to be the keeper of the family and the throne without the husband at whose side she had kept them. That she did go on, with her back straight and her duty undiminished, was no more than everyone expected of her. But it cost her, in private, more than anyone but she would ever know. What she did in the very moment of his death has come down to us, and it tells you everything about her. As the old king breathed his last and ceased to be, Mary turned to her eldest son, the man who in that very instant had become king in his father's place, and she took his hand and kissed it. It was an act of the most extraordinary self-command, and the most absolute understanding of what she was. The consort doing homage to the new sovereign in the very room where her husband lay dead, the woman setting her own raw grief aside to honour the office before the man. She had spent her whole life subduing the private self to the great office of the crown, and now, in the hardest moment of all, she did it once more by pure instinct, completely. The king was dead, the gesture said, "Long live the king." But the son whose hand she kissed, the new sovereign on whom everything now rested, was the very child who would, within a single year, break her heart and shake the throne to its foundations, as it had not been shaken in living memory. The new king was her eldest son, the boy they had called David in the nursery, who took the throne now as Edward VIII. He was charming, glamorous, restless, and beloved by the public, a slight and golden figure who seemed to embody the modern age as his solid old parents never could. But beneath the charm there ran a deep unsteadiness, a willfulness, and a want of that patient sense of duty. His mother prized above every earthly thing, and there was, at the very centre of the crisis that now unfolded, a woman. The king was in love, deeply and immovably in love, with an American named Wallis Simpson, a sharp, elegant, twice-married woman then in the course of divorcing her second husband, and the king was determined, against all advice and all opposition, to marry her, and to make her his queen. To him it was the simplest matter of the heart. To almost everyone else it was impossible, for in that age the king stood as the head of the church, and the church did not permit the remarriage of the divorced, while a former partner still lived, and a wife with two living husbands could not, it was felt on every side, be set upon the throne of England beside him. The collision that followed, and what it did to Mary, is where we go next. For Queen Mary, watching it all unfold from the fresh grief of her widowhood, it was an agony of a particular and terrible kind, because it struck at the one thing she held most sacred of all. Her whole life, every sacrifice and each swallowed feeling, had been built upon a single unshakable conviction that the office of the crown stands above the desires of the person who wears it, that duty comes before happiness, that the sovereign exists to serve the throne and not the throne to serve the sovereign. And here was her own son, the king, preparing to do the one thing she could not forgive, to set his private longing above his sacred duty, to put his own happiness before the crown itself. She held him dear, and she pleaded with him, and she could not move him, and her anguish was real and deep. For a son she had raised, however imperfectly, was still a son, and what she felt in those autumn weeks was the particular helplessness of a parent watching a child stride toward a precipice and being wholly unable to call him back. She tried. There were meetings, painful ones, in which the mother who had given her whole self to the idea of duty confronted the son who was about to lay that idea down, and neither could reach the other across the gulf between them. To her it was incomprehensible that anyone, least of all a king, could place his own happiness above the throne. The very thought ran against everything she was. To him she must have seemed cold, immovable, unable to understand the simple human fact that he loved a woman and could not live without her. They were speaking different languages, the one all obligation and the other all feeling, and there was no translating between them. She loved him and could not save him, could not even, in the end, quite forgive him, and the wound of that failure, the one child she truly lost, not to death but to a choice she could not fathom, stayed with her always. But there was never the slightest doubt where she herself stood. When it came at last to the unthinkable choice, when the king found he could not keep both the woman and the throne, and chose in the end, the woman, Queen Mary's heart broke, but her conviction did not bend by so much as a hair. In December of 1936, less than a year after his father's death, Edward VIII gave up the crown of England in order to marry the one he loved, the first king in the long history of the country ever to lay down the throne of his own free will and walked away into a long exile. And his mother, who could not fathom how any child of hers could so abandon his duty, never truly forgave him for it to the end of her days. The breach never truly healed. In the years that followed, the exiled former king and the wife he had given up the throne to marry lived abroad, and Mary's attitude toward them remained one of cold and unbending disapproval, softened by a mother's lingering love, but never by acceptance. She could not reconcile herself to what he had done, could not see his abandonment of his duty as anything but a betrayal of everything she held sacred, and she made her judgment plain by the simple force of her reserve. It was a sorrow that sat heavily on her old age, the estrangement from her firstborn, the son she had raised to be a king and watched walk away from the throne. She loved him still, in the locked-away fashion that was the only way she knew how to love, and she grieved the loss of him as a kind of living bereavement. But on the central question, the question of duty against desire, the throne against the self, she never wavered for an instant, not even for the child she had borne. To her, some things stood above even a mother's love, and the crown was the first of them. The crown that Edward laid down passed, as it had to the next brother. And here the story turns towards something almost like redemption, for the new king was Bertie, the second son, the nervous, delicate, stammering boy who had been so frightened of his father and so overshadowed all his life, the least likely of all her children ever to wear a crown. He took the throne as George VI, in conscious echo of his father's name, a deliberate signal that the steadiness and the duty of the old reign would carry on unbroken after the shock of the abdication, and he was terrified. He had never wanted the throne, never expected it, never been prepared for it. He struggled with a stammer that made the public speaking of a modern king an ordeal of real suffering. He felt himself wholly unequal to the burden his brother's desertion had dropped upon his shoulders. And in that moment of fear and crisis, his mother became exactly what the family and the country needed her to be, the great steadying presence, the living proof that the throne endured, the very embodiment of a continuity that no abdication could break. She did it partly by simply being there, magnificent and unbroken, the old queen who had stood at the heart of the monarchy for a quarter of a century and more, lending her frightened son the borrowed strength of her own unshakable faith in the office he now held. She had broken her own long-held rule to do it, for a widowed queen would ordinarily have drawn back from the front of affairs, and she had always maintained that her consort's public life ended with her husband's reign. But the crisis was too great, and her sense of duty too strong, and so she came forward once more, appearing at her son's side, showing the country that the family stood firm, that whatever one prince had thrown away, the rest of them would hold. It was perhaps the greatest single service she ever rendered the monarchy, this steadying of a shaken throne and a frightened king by the sheer weight of her presence and her belief, and George VI, who loved and revered her, leaned upon it gratefully. She lent her new king more than her presence. She lent him the unbroken thread of the past. By standing at his side, magnificent and unchanged, the same grave figure the country had known for a generation. She made the join almost invisible, so that the people looking on saw not a rupture but a continuation, not a throne snatched up by an unprepared younger brother, but the same steady monarchy carrying calmly on. It was exactly the message the moment required, and no one else could have delivered it as she did, for no one else embodied continuity so completely. And privately, away from the public eye, she gave her son and his wife, and their 2 small daughters, the steadying force of her absolute confidence, her certainty that the thing could be done, and that he was the man to do it. A frightened person leans hardest on whoever refuses to be frightened, and Mary, whatever she felt within, refused. She had spent a lifetime not being frightened where others quailed, and now, at the end of it, that hard-won steadiness became the gift she gave her reluctant son, and through him, the throne itself. The reluctant king found his feet, the throne held. And within a very few years it would need every ounce of strength it could find, for the storm clouds were massing once more across Europe, and the old queen, now well past 70, would live to see her country fight for its very life a second time. And that is where this evening takes us next. When the Second World War came, in the autumn of 1939, it was judged too dangerous for the aged Queen Mary to remain in London beneath the bombs, and so, with great reluctance, for she dearly wished to share her people's danger, she was persuaded to leave the capital and to spend the war years deep in the countryside, at Badminton, the great house of her niece and the niece's husband in the Western Shires. She went unwillingly, and she made, by every account, a thoroughly demanding guest, descending upon the household with an immense retinue and an immovable sense of how things ought to be done. But what is most charming and most human in the whole of her long story belongs to these years, for the grave and magnificent old queen, set down in the deep country with a war to be got through, threw herself into rural life with an energy that delighted everyone around her. She conceived a furious campaign against ivy, which she had decided was a menace to be torn from every wall and tree on the estate, and she would set out at the head of a working party to wage war upon it. She gathered scrap metal for the war effort with a collector's relentless zeal, and, best loved of all, when she went out in her car and passed soldiers or working men trudging along the country roads, she would stop and insist on giving them a lift, so that astonished servicemen found themselves riding through the lanes beside the old Queen of England, who questioned them keenly about their lives the whole way. The stiff, remote, awe-inspiring matriarch had become, in her old age, and in the strange levelling of the war, something almost approachable, a familiar and rather wonderful old lady, sharing in her own way the great ordeal of her people. Ennispact, she chafed all the same at being kept from London, and never quite forgave the necessity that held her in the country while her people endured the bombing she longed to share. She wrote letters to the front and to her family. She knitted and gathered and organised. She descended upon the local life of the place with a force that exhausted everyone around her, and she followed every turn of the war with fierce attention, refusing to believe for a moment that it could end in anything but victory. Her energy, at well past 70, was a marvel and a trial in equal measure to the household that hosted her. But beneath the brusqueness and the demands there was a real and steadying courage, the same courage that had carried her through every trial of her life, and it communicated itself to all around her. An old queen who would not be downcast, who tore at the ivy and badgered the soldiers, and waited out the dark years with her chin up, was its own small contribution to the morale of a frightened nation, and she made it gladly, and would have made a far larger one had they only let her stay in town. The war was won at last, and Queen Mary came home to London to her house at Marlborough, an old woman now in her late 70s, the last great link to a vanished age. The world she returned to was utterly changed from the confident imperial one of her youth, the empire beginning to loosen and dissolve, the old certainties gone, a humbler and more democratic age coming into being. But she herself went on, upright and unbending, a magnificent relic of the past moving through the present like a figure from an old history stepped down into the daylight, still collecting, still studying her treasures, still holding herself and everyone around her to the exacting standards of a vanished time. She had now lived through the reigns of an astonishing span of sovereigns. She had been the subject of one queen, the consort of one king, the mother of two more, and the line ran on past her still. In those final years she became a beloved institution in her own right, a living link to a vanished age, instantly known by her toque hats and her parasols, and her upright, unhurried progress through the London she had watched change beyond recognition. She went on with her engagements, her galleries and her charities and her collecting, refusing the concessions of age, holding herself to the same exacting standard she had held to all her life. People who glimpsed her in the street felt they were seeing a piece of history walk by, and in a sense they were, for she had been a girl when Victoria reigned and was now the grandmother of a queen yet to be crowned. She had outlived the empire's high noon, 2 world wars, and most of the people she had known in her youth, and she met the strange new post-war world with the same composure she had met everything else, neither bending to it nor railing against it, simply enduring, as she had always endured, upright to the last. She took a deep and watchful interest, in those last years, in the young family who represented the throne's future, the granddaughter who would one day reign, and the small great-grandchildren coming up behind her. She had strong views, as she had strong views on everything, about how they should be brought up and what was owed to their position, and she did not hesitate to make those views known, but there was tenderness in it too, the softened tenderness of the very old for the very young, and a quiet satisfaction in seeing the line she had served run on so surely into the future. She took her great-grandchildren to see the sights, the museums, and the galleries she loved, passing on, in her undemonstrative way, the lifelong devotion to beautiful and historic things that had sustained her since her own girlhood in Florence. It was as near as she came, perhaps, to the easy grandmotherly warmth she had never quite managed with her own children, and there is a rightness in that at the very end the guarded heart unclenched a little, and the old queen found a gentler way of loving in the generation furthest from her own, for she had one last passing of the crown to witness, and one last grief to carry before her own long life was done. In February of 1952, her son George VI, the once reluctant king who had grown into so loved and so dutiful a sovereign, worn out by the strain of the war, years and by illness, died in his sleep at Sandringham, in the very house where his father had died before him. For Queen Mary it was the cruelest of blows, to outlive a second of her sons upon the throne, to bury the child, who had risen so bravely to the duty his brother had cast aside. She bore it as she had borne everything, with an iron and sorrowing composure, and she turned her loyalty at once, as she always did, to the new sovereign, for the crown had passed now to her granddaughter, a young woman of 25 who became Queen Elizabeth II, the old queen, who had done homage in her time to her dead husband's heir, now gave her allegiance to the girl who was her son's daughter, the 4th sovereign of her own lifetime, to whom she had bowed her head. There is something deeply moving in that final passing of the torch, the very old queen and the very young one, the woman who had been a consort under Victoria's shadow, now bending her allegiance to a granddaughter of 25. Mary had seen the whole arc of it, from the high imperial confidence of her youth to this humbler, harder, more uncertain age, and she had served it faithfully at every turn, never once putting herself before the throne she lived to uphold. Now the duty she had given her life to was passing into the hands of a girl young enough to be the great-granddaughter she nearly was, and Mary, failing fast, gave that girl the same absolute loyalty she had given to every sovereign before her. It was the last act of a lifetime of service, the old keeper of the continuity handing it on, intact and unbroken, to the one who would carry it forward into a future she herself would not see. And she had one last quiet wish, wholly in keeping with all that had gone before. She was failing now, and she knew it, and she feared that her own death might cast a shadow over the great crowning of her granddaughter that was even then being prepared. And so she left careful instructions that, should she die before the day, the ceremony was on no account to be put off or dimmed by mourning for her. The throne came first, as it always had. Her wish was granted, in the end, in the gentlest possible way. In March of 1953, a little more than 2 months before her granddaughter was to be crowned, Queen Mary died quietly at her house in London, in her 86th year, an old woman at the close of one of the longest and most extraordinary lives the monarchy had ever known. She did not live to see the crowning she had so wished not to spoil, but she had made certain it would go forward undimmed. And on the great day, when the young queen rode through the cheering streets to be hallowed in the old abbey, the people remembered the magnificent old lady who had so very nearly lived to see it, and who had asked, with her last strength, that nothing should stand in the way of the continuity she had served her whole life long. It was, in the end, the fitting close for her to slip away just short of the great ceremony, having spent her final breath making sure the throne would carry on unbroken. The country mourned her deeply, with the particular tenderness reserved for the very old who have been present all one's life. She had been a fixed point for so long, through so much change, that her passing felt like the closing of a whole era, the last link severed with the vanished imperial world of Victoria and the long Edwardian afternoon. Crowds filed past her coffin in their tens of thousands. And then, as she had wished, the mourning was set gently aside, and a few weeks later the young queen was crowned in the abbey, amid all the splendour that her grandmother had insisted should not be dimmed. There could have been no truer monument to Mary than that, a coronation going forward unshadowed because she had willed it so, the continuity she had served unbroken even by her own death. She had spent her life making sure the show would go on, the great solemn show of monarchy that she believed in with her whole heart, and her last act was to make sure that it did. Few people are granted an ending so perfectly in keeping with the entire arc of their lives. She had earned hers, and so we come to the end of her, and it is worth sitting a moment with the whole shape of the life we have followed tonight, because there are few lives in all of history that travelled quite so far. Think back to where she began, the watchful girl in the worn apartments of Kensington Palace, born royal but not quite royal enough, the daughter of a kindly spendthrift mother and an anxious wounded father, the child whose family crept abroad to escape their debts, the young woman whose marriage hopes were clouded by a shadow over her blood, who was so nearly set aside as a poor and forgotten spinster at the fringe of the family. And then think of where she ended, the grand old matriarch in her ropes of pearls, the consort who had stood crowned upon a dais in India before a fifth of the human race, the mother and grandmother of kings and a queen, the fixed and unbreakable point around which the monarchy steadied itself through a world war, a revolution of toppled thrones, the abdication of her own son, and a second war besides. The distance between those two figures, the doubtful girl and the magnificent queen, is almost beyond the measuring, and she crossed it not by charm, of which she had little, and not by beauty, and not by luck, but by the one quality she had forged in herself in childhood, and never once let slip the quality of unyielding, self-effacing, lifelong duty. It was not always a warm life, and we should not pretend that it was. The very armour that made her so magnificent in public made her distant with her own children, and some of them carried the wound of it all their lives. The same fierce devotion to the office of the crown that made her so steady a queen made her at times hard and unbending toward the living hearts around her, even toward her own sons. She was not an easy woman to love, and she found it hard, perhaps, to show love, and that is part of her truth and ought not to be smoothed away. But she was, by any measure, a great one, great in her endurance, deep in her sense of service, unflinching in her performance of a part that asked her to be a symbol rather than a self, and to subdue over and over again her own feeling to her sense of what she owed. And there was that other gift, quieter and more tender, the gift of the girl who had learned in the galleries of Florence that beautiful things endure, who spent a lifetime gathering up and guarding the memory and the treasures of her family, set on the conviction that the past should be saved and known and handed on. In a sense, that was the whole of her, the one who held things together, who kept and guarded and preserved, who stood firm, so that others might have something firm to lean upon. She was the keeper of the continuity, and when she slipped away, just short of her granddaughter's crowning, she left that continuity unbroken behind her, which was the only monument she would ever have wished for. Before I let you go, and let this evening close, let me say one last gentle word, as I promised I would not say much. If something in this slow walk through the long days of a woman who gave all she had to the keeping of what lasts has been worth the sitting up for, then you would be most welcome to stay on a while, and to fall asleep again in my company on some other night, over another life, in the still hours when the rest of the household has gone quiet. There are a great many more such lives waiting to be told, and it would be my pleasure to tell them to you. You are always welcome to subscribe, and to wander back to this place whenever a little quiet would do you good. None of it asks anything of you at this hour. There is only this, the few hours we have spent together in the company of a vanished queen, and the slow letting go that comes after. So let the image of her fade now, the magnificent old lady in her pearls, the watchful girl in the worn palace, the still figure who held so much together for so long. Let her settle back into the past where she belongs, and let your own thoughts grow soft and loose and slow. The day is behind you. There is nothing more that needs doing tonight, nothing left to hold on to, nothing to carry. There is only the warmth around you, and the dark beyond it, and the rising tide of sleep coming in. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.